900-pound Kodiak bear, Maules Park ranger to death in church parking lot, June 3, 2024. The morning of June 3, 2024 dawned crisp and clear over Homer, Alaska, with the kind of pristine blue sky that seemed to promise nothing but good things ahead. Thomas Matthew Green, a 34-year-old park ranger with the Katmai National Park Service, had awakened at 5:30 a.m. in his modest two-bedroom cabin on Pioneer Avenue, following his usual Sunday routine that had remained unchanged for the past 6 years. The ritual was sacred to him. Coffee first, black and strong, brewed in the same blue enamel pot his grandfather had used during his own decades of service in Alaska's wilderness. Then 30 minutes of reading from the worn leather Bible his mother had given him when he first moved to Alaska in 2018, followed by a quick breakfast of oatmeal with locally harvested blueberries and a single piece of toast with honey from the beekeeper down the road. Thomas stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with the lean, weathered build of a man who spent most of his waking hours outdoors in some of the most challenging terrain in North America. His sandy brown hair, perpetually tousled by the constant coastal winds, was beginning to show flecks of premature grey at the temples, something his colleagues often teased him about. His green eyes, the colour of sagebrush after rain, held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions in split seconds. Those eyes had guided countless tourists safely through bear country, had spotted the telltale signs of weather turning dangerous hours before others noticed, and had maintained their calm focus during 3 separate grizzly encounters during his tenure with the Park Service. Born and raised in Fairbanks to parents who had moved north from Minnesota in the 1970s, seeking a simpler life, Thomas had grown up understanding that Alaska demanded respect, preparation, and an acknowledgement that humans were not the apex predators in this vast wilderness. His father, Robert Green, had worked as a bush pilot for 32 years, flying supplies to remote villages and researchers to field stations scattered across the interior. His mother, Sarah Green, had been a registered nurse at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, dealing with the unique challenges of providing medical care in a state where the nearest trauma center might be hundreds of miles away by air. The Green family dinner table had been filled with stories of survival, of the importance of preparation, and of the profound respect required when living alongside Alaska's wildlife. Thomas had learned to shoot at age 8, not for sport, but as a fundamental survival skill. He had learned to read weather patterns by age 10, understanding that in Alaska, meteorological ignorance could be lethal. By 12, he could start a fire in wet conditions, purify water from natural sources, and had memorized the behavioral patterns of every major predator species in the state. After graduating from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, with a degree in wildlife biology and natural resource management, Thomas had worked briefly for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game before finding his calling with the National Park Service. His assignment to Katmai National Park had been a dream posting, overseeing one of the world's premier brown bear habitats and helping to manage the delicate balance between conservation efforts and public access to wilderness areas. Katmai, established in 1918 and expanded to its current 4.7 million acres in 1980, was home to an estimated 2,200 brown bears, the largest protected population in the world. The park's Brooks Falls had become world famous for the spectacular sight of massive brown bears catching salmon during their upstream migration, with live webcams broadcasting the ancient ritual to millions of viewers worldwide. Thomas had spent countless hours at Brooks Camp, educating visitors about bear safety, mediating conflicts between photographers eager for the perfect shot and bears simply trying to fish, and ensuring that the 285,000 annual visitors could experience the wonder of Alaska's wilderness without becoming statistics. But Thomas's expertise extended far beyond the boundaries of Katmai. As one of only 12 certified human bear conflict specialists in Alaska, he was frequently called upon to assist other agencies when problem bears needed to be relocated or, in worst-case scenarios, when human-bear encounters had gone tragically wrong. He had been involved in 17 separate bear relocations over the past 3 years, using his deep understanding of bear behavior and psychology to find solutions that preserved both human safety and bear lives. His colleagues at the Park Service knew him as methodical, cautious, and absolutely reliable. Sarah Chen, a fellow ranger who had worked with Thomas for 4 years, often said that if she were ever in trouble in bear country, Thomas Green was the one person she would want to have with her. His incident reports were legendary for their thoroughness and clarity, helping other rangers learn from each encounter and continuously improve safety protocols. Thomas lived alone, though not from lack of social connections. He had been engaged to Jennifer Morrison, a wildlife photographer from Anchorage, but the relationship had ended amicably 2 years earlier when her career opportunities had taken her to assignments in Africa and South America. They remained close friends, and Jennifer still occasionally consulted with Thomas when working on projects involving North American wildlife. His social life centered around the tight-knit community of Homer, population 5,515, where everyone knew their neighbors and looked out for each other through the long, dark winters and the brief, intense summers. Homer had been founded in 1896 and named after Homer Pennock, a con man who had promoted non-existent coal fields in the area. Despite its founder's dubious legacy, the town had grown into a genuine community built around commercial fishing, tourism, and the kind of rugged individualism that attracted people seeking to live life on their own terms. The town sat on the shore of Kachemak Bay, with the dramatic backdrop of snow-capped mountains across the water and the famous Homer Spit extending 4.5 miles into the bay. The Community Covenant Church, where Thomas had been a regular attendee for the past 6 years, sat on a modest rise overlooking the bay, about 2 miles from the main tourist areas. The church building itself was a simple structure built in 1987, with white clapboard siding and a modest steeple topped by a brass cross that caught the morning sun. The congregation numbered about 120 regular members, predominantly families who had been in Homer for multiple generations, along with a smaller group of transplants like Thomas, who had been drawn to Alaska's wilderness and stayed to build lives there. Pastor Michael Rodriguez, a 52-year-old former commercial fisherman who had felt called to ministry after surviving a near-fatal storm in the Bering Sea 15 years earlier, led services that reflected the practical spirituality of people who faced nature's power on a daily basis. His sermons often drew parallels between biblical teachings and the realities of life in Alaska, where community support and personal responsibility were not abstract concepts, but daily necessities for survival. The church parking lot was a simple gravel rectangle that accommodated about 40 vehicles, surrounded by a mixture of spruce and birch trees that provided a natural windbreak against the constant coastal breezes. The lot sat adjacent to a larger area of mixed forest that extended back toward the Kenai Mountains, part of a wildlife corridor that allowed animals to move between the higher elevations and the coastal areas where food sources were more abundant during certain seasons. This morning, as Thomas prepared for the 9 a.m. service, he had no way of knowing that approximately 12 miles away, in the dense alder thickets near the Anchor River, a massive male Kodiak bear was beginning a journey that would bring their paths together in less than 4 hours. The bear, later designated as Bear 747 by Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologists, was an exceptional specimen even by the standards of Kodiak Island's famous population. At an estimated 900 pounds, he represented the upper end of the size range for male brown bears, with a body length of nearly 10 feet from nose to tail and a shoulder height that reached 4.5 feet when walking on all fours. When standing on his hind legs, as brown bears often do when investigating their surroundings, he towered nearly 9 feet tall. Bear 747's massive size was the product of exceptional genetics, abundant food sources, and an estimated age of 18 to 20 years, making him a mature adult in his prime. His coat was the rich, chocolate-brown color typical of coastal Alaskan bears, with lighter-colored guard hairs that gave him a distinctive silver-tipped appearance in direct sunlight. His face showed the battle scars of 2 decades of wilderness life, a partially healed scar across his muzzle from a salmon fishing dispute with another bear 5 years earlier, and a notch in his left ear from an encounter with a porcupine during his adolescence. Biologists who later examined Bear 747's history through collar data and photographic records determined that he had been born in 2004 or 2005 in the remote wilderness area near Katmai National Park. His mother, designated as Bear 402, had been one of the most successful female bears in the region, raising 11 cubs to independence over her lifetime. Bear 747 had been part of a litter of 2 cubs, along with a female sibling who had been struck and killed by a tour bus in 2008 during her 2nd year of independence. The bear's early years had been spent learning the complex survival skills required for life in Alaska's wilderness. From his mother, he had learned which plants were nutritious and when they reached peak ripeness, how to fish for salmon during the annual runs, how to dig for clams at low tide, and most crucially, how to assess and respond to threats from other bears and humans. Male brown bears like Bear 747 were primarily solitary once they reached maturity, with the exception of brief mating seasons and occasional congregation around abundant food sources like salmon runs. Bear 747's territory encompassed approximately 200 square miles of varied habitat, from the coastal areas where he dug for clams and caught salmon, to the higher elevation areas where he foraged for berries and hibernated during the long winters. Like all brown bears, he was an omnivore with an incredibly diverse diet that changed seasonally. In spring, he fed primarily on new grass shoots, skunk cabbage, and occasionally newborn moose or caribou calves. Summer brought the salmon runs that provided the protein and fat necessary for surviving the winter hibernation. Fall was dedicated to consuming massive quantities of berries, particularly blueberries and salmon berries, along with any remaining salmon. The bear's behavior on the morning of June 3rd had initially followed normal patterns. He had awakened from his daybed, a shallow depression he had created in the thick underbrush near a small stream, and begun foraging for the tender shoots of devil's club and salmonberries. His massive paws, each equipped with claws up to 4 inches long, allowed him to dig efficiently for roots and small mammals, while also serving as formidable weapons when necessary. But something was different this morning. Later analysis would reveal that Bear 747 had been exhibiting unusual behavior for the past week, behavior that wildlife biologists would classify as potentially dangerous. Trail cameras positioned throughout his territory had captured images of the bear approaching human structures more closely than normal, including a fish processing facility, 2 remote cabins, and a section of the Sterling Highway where tourists often stop to take photographs. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, a wildlife biologist with 30 years of experience studying brown bear behavior, would later theorize that Bear 747 had been experiencing what researchers call food conditioning, a dangerous process where bears begin to associate human activity with food sources. This conditioning could result from something as simple as improperly stored garbage, dropped food items, or well-meaning tourists who ignored regulations about feeding wildlife. The morning of June 3rd marked what appeared to be a critical escalation in the bear's behavior. Instead of remaining in his usual foraging areas, Bear 747 had begun moving steadily toward more populated areas, following a route that would bring him into direct contact with human activity. His movement pattern, later reconstructed through paw print analysis and witness reports, indicated purposeful travel rather than the meandering path typical of a bear simply foraging. At 6:15 a.m., approximately 45 minutes after Thomas Green had begun his morning routine, Bear 747 crossed the Sterling Highway for the first time in his documented history. The highway, Alaska Route 1, was the primary transportation corridor connecting the Kenai Peninsula to Anchorage and the rest of Alaska. Even in the early morning hours, the highway carried a steady stream of traffic from commercial fishermen heading to their boats, tourists beginning day trips, and local residents commuting to work. Margaret Foster, a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher from Homer, was driving her 2019 Toyota Prius to her volunteer shift at the local animal shelter when she became the first person to encounter Bear 747 that morning. Margaret had lived in Alaska for 43 years and had seen hundreds of bears at various distances, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of the massive animal emerging from the tree line directly ahead of her vehicle. "I was driving maybe 45 miles per hour, which was normal for that section of road," Margaret would later tell investigators. "The visibility was perfect. Clear sky, no fog, excellent lighting. I saw movement in my peripheral vision and turned to look, thinking it might be a moose. When I realized it was a bear, I couldn't believe the size of it. I've seen plenty of bears over the years, but this one was just enormous. He seemed completely unconcerned about the road or the cars. He just walked across like he owned the place." Margaret immediately pulled over and used her cell phone to call the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's wildlife hotline, reporting the bear's location and unusual behavior. Her call, logged at 6:17 a.m., would later be recognized as the first official warning of Bear 747's movement toward populated areas. "I told them this wasn't normal bear behavior," Margaret recalled. "In all my years here, I've never seen a bear show that kind of confidence around a major highway. Usually they avoid roads, especially when there's traffic. This bear seemed like he had a destination in mind." Chatu. The dispatcher who took Margaret's call, Janet Williams, was a 15-year veteran of Alaska's wildlife emergency system. She immediately forwarded the report to the regional wildlife biologist and entered the information into the statewide bear activity database. However, the early morning timing meant that most wildlife management personnel were not yet available, and the initial response focused on issuing a general advisory to local law enforcement rather than immediate intervention. Bear 747 continued his journey after crossing the highway, moving through a series of private properties and undeveloped land parcels toward Homer. His route took him past 2 occupied residences, where he investigated outdoor garbage storage areas and a dog pen before continuing on. At the second residence, belonging to retired fisherman Carl Jameson, the bear's presence triggered a motion-activated security camera that captured high-quality footage of the animal. The footage, later analyzed frame by wildlife experts, showed Bear 747 displaying what biologists call investigative behavior, rather than typical foraging. Instead of immediately searching for food sources, the bear appeared to be systematically exploring human structures and scent trails. He spent nearly 20 minutes examining the perimeter of Jameson's property, paying particular attention to areas where human activity was concentrated. Carl Jameson, age 73, had been asleep when the bear visited his property and only discovered the animal's presence when he reviewed his security footage later that morning. "I've had bears on my property before," Jameson told reporters. "Usually they're after the garbage or maybe investigating the salmon I sometimes clean in the backyard. But this bear was different. He seemed to be learning about the place, like he was making a map in his head." The security footage showed Bear 747 approaching within 10 feet of Jameson's back door, standing on his hind legs to investigate the scent trail left by the residents' daily activities. The bear spent several minutes examining the door itself before moving to investigate other structures on the property. Wildlife experts who reviewed the footage noted that the bear's body language showed confidence and curiosity, rather than the typical caution bears display around human habitation. By 7:30 a.m., Bear 747 had covered approximately 6 miles from his initial highway crossing point and was entering the outer residential areas of Homer. His path had taken him through a mixture of forest and residential zones, following natural corridors that provided cover while also allowing him to investigate human activity. The bear's route suggested familiarity with the area, though wildlife biologists had no previous records of him ranging this far from his established territory. Thomas Green, meanwhile, had completed his morning routine and was preparing to leave for church. His Sunday preparation was as methodical as everything else in his life: shower, shave, and careful selection of clothes appropriate for Alaska's unpredictable weather. Even for church, Thomas dressed with the practical awareness of someone who might need to respond to an emergency at any moment. His outfit consisted of sturdy khaki pants, a light blue button-down shirt, and a fleece vest that could provide warmth if the weather turned cold. Before leaving his cabin, Thomas checked his emergency communication equipment, a habit ingrained through years of wilderness work. His handheld radio was fully charged and tuned to the Park Service frequency. His cell phone showed full battery and signal strength, and his emergency GPS beacon was functioning normally. These weren't paranoid precautions, but standard practice for someone whose professional expertise was regularly needed in crisis situations. Thomas's cabin was located on Pioneer Avenue, approximately 1.2 miles from the Community Covenant Church. The route he would normally take involved driving down Pioneer Avenue to the Sterling Highway, then following Ocean Drive toward the bay before turning onto the gravel road that led to the church. The drive typically took 8 minutes, allowing him to arrive a few minutes early for the 9 a.m. service. As Thomas locked his cabin door and walked toward his 2021 Ford F-150, he paused for a moment to appreciate the morning. The sky was a brilliant blue, with just a few wisps of high clouds that suggested the weather would remain stable throughout the day. The temperature was a comfortable 52 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect for the post-service gathering that Pastor Rodriguez had planned for the church's small outdoor area. The truck, painted in the distinctive dark green used by the National Park Service, was equipped with the specialized gear Thomas needed for his work: emergency medical supplies, wildlife deterrent devices, communication equipment, and cold weather survival gear. The vehicle's cargo area contained everything from bear spray to emergency flares, from thermal blankets to a portable GPS mapping system. Thomas had learned early in his career that in Alaska, being prepared for the unexpected wasn't optional. At 8:42 a.m., Thomas started his truck and began the familiar drive to church, completely unaware that Bear 747 was at that moment investigating a residential area less than 2 miles from the Community Covenant Church. The bear had spent the past hour moving through a series of neighborhoods, leaving evidence of his presence in the form of damaged garbage cans, investigated bird feeders, and paw prints in garden areas. Linda Martinez, a 45-year-old nurse who lived on Bartlett Street, had discovered the bear's presence when she went outside to retrieve her Sunday newspaper. "I opened my front door and saw my garbage can tipped over and garbage scattered everywhere," she told investigators. "At first, I thought it might have been dogs or maybe kids playing a prank. But then I saw the paw prints in my flower bed, and I knew immediately it was a bear. The prints were enormous, bigger than any bear prints I'd ever seen." Linda immediately went back inside and called 911, reporting the bear's presence in her neighborhood. Her call, logged at 8:35 a.m., was the second official report of Bear 747's unusual movement pattern. The Homer Police Department dispatcher who took the call immediately contacted the Alaska State Troopers and the Department of Fish and Game, initiating what should have been a coordinated response to a potentially dangerous situation. However, the response was hampered by the timing and the jurisdictional complexity of wildlife management in Alaska. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had primary responsibility for wildlife issues, but their nearest biologist was in Anchorage, nearly 4 hours away by road. The Alaska State Troopers could respond more quickly, but their protocols for dealing with problem bears required coordination with fish and game personnel. Local police departments like Homer's had limited authority and resources for wildlife issues, typically serving as first responders who contained situations until state-level experts could arrive. Sergeant Roy Thompson of the Alaska State Troopers received the dispatch report at 8:41 a.m., just as Thomas Green was starting his truck for the drive to church. Sergeant Thompson, a 28-year veteran of law enforcement in Alaska, immediately understood the potential seriousness of the situation. A large bear moving through residential areas in daylight represented a significant public safety threat, particularly on a Sunday morning when families with children might be outdoors. My immediate concern was getting accurate information about the bear's location and movement pattern, Sergeant Thompson later explained. We had 2 separate sightings about 2 hours and 6 miles apart, which suggested the bear was moving steadily toward more populated areas. That's never a good sign, especially with an animal that size. Sergeant Thompson immediately dispatched 2 patrol units to begin canvassing the area where the bear had last been reported, while simultaneously coordinating with fish and game personnel to get a wildlife biologist en route to Homer. He also issued a general advisory to local law enforcement agencies, alerting them to the presence of a large bear in the Homer area and requesting reports of any additional sightings. At 8:45 a.m., as Thomas Green was driving down Pioneer Avenue toward the church, Bear 747 was investigating the backyard area of a residence on Fairview Avenue, less than 1 mile from the Community Covenant Church. The bear had discovered a compost pile behind the house, along with a bird feeding station that had been knocked down during a recent windstorm. The combination of food scents and the bear's increasing boldness created a dangerous situation that was rapidly escalating. Patricia Webb, the 58-year-old homeowner, was in her kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard unusual noises from her backyard. It sounded like something large moving around, maybe knocking things over, she recalled. I looked out my kitchen window and couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was this enormous bear just 20 feet from my house, going through my compost pile like he owned the place. Patricia immediately retreated from the window and called 911, becoming the 3rd person to report the bear's presence that morning. Her call, logged at 8:47 a.m., provided the most precise location information yet, allowing law enforcement to triangulate the bear's probable movement pattern and projected route. The 911 dispatcher who took Patricia's call, Maria Santos, had been with the Homer Police Department's Communications Center for 12 years and had handled numerous wildlife reports during that time. However, the size of the bear described by Patricia, combined with its apparent lack of fear around human habitation, immediately elevated the situation to emergency status. I could hear the fear in her voice, Maria later said. She kept saying, "This isn't normal bear behavior." This bear isn't afraid of anything. When someone who's lived in Alaska for 25 years says that about a bear, you know you're dealing with a serious situation. Maria immediately dispatched all available patrol units to the Fairview Avenue area, while simultaneously alerting emergency medical services to stand by for a possible wildlife encounter. She also initiated contact with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's emergency response team, providing them with the detailed location information and behavioral descriptions that would be crucial for developing an intervention strategy. At 8:52 a.m., Thomas Green pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Community Covenant Church, selected a parking space in his usual area near the back of the lot, and turned off his truck's engine. He sat for a moment, appreciating the peaceful morning and looking forward to the service and the fellowship that would follow. Thomas had developed genuine friendships within the church community, people who appreciated his expertise and dedication, while also understanding the unique challenges of his profession. The parking lot contained 17 vehicles when Thomas arrived, indicating a typical Sunday morning attendance. He recognized most of the cars and trucks, belonging to families like the Johnsons, with their 3 young children, elderly couples like Harold and Dorothy Peterson, who had been attending the church for 15 years, and single adults like himself, who had found community and spiritual guidance within the congregation. As Thomas walked toward the church building, he exchanged greetings with several other early arrivals. Martha Reynolds, a 42-year-old elementary school teacher, waved from the church's front steps, where she was chatting with Pastor Rodriguez about the morning's scripture reading. Bill Santos, a commercial fisherman who had known Thomas since his first week in Homer, called out a good-natured comment about the Rangers' prospects in the upcoming baseball season. The normal, comfortable routine of Sunday morning continued as Thomas entered the church building, found his usual seat in the 3rd pew on the left side, and began reviewing the morning's bulletin. The service would include readings from Psalms and the Gospel of Matthew, along with a sermon Pastor Rodriguez had titled Stewardship of Creation, focusing on humanity's responsibility to care for the natural world. At exactly 9 a.m., as Pastor Rodriguez called the congregation to worship with the opening hymn, Morning Has Broken, Bear 747 emerged from the tree line that bordered the eastern edge of the Community Covenant Church property. The bear had followed a natural corridor of mixed forest that provided cover while allowing him to move steadily toward the sounds and scents of human activity. His route had taken him past the last residential area and through approximately 200 yards of undeveloped land before bringing him to the church grounds. The transition from forest to the maintained church property represented a significant escalation in his proximity to concentrated human activity. Bear 747 paused at the edge of the tree line, standing on his hind legs to survey the area ahead. His exceptional height allowed him to see over most of the vehicles in the parking lot, giving him a comprehensive view of the church building, the parking area, and the people moving between cars and the entrance. The bear's body language, later analyzed from security camera footage, showed interest and confidence rather than the typical caution bears display when encountering new environments. Inside the church, the congregation had begun the opening hymn, their voices joining in the familiar melody that had opened Sunday services for decades. Thomas Green, standing in his usual position in the 3rd pew, sang along while his mind wandered briefly to the work week ahead. He was scheduled to lead a group of visiting researchers on a bear observation expedition to Brooks Camp, followed by meetings with park administrators about updated safety protocols for the busy summer tourist season. The church's interior was simple but welcoming, with wooden pews arranged to accommodate about 100 people, a modest altar area decorated with seasonal flowers from local gardens, and large windows that provided natural light and views of the surrounding landscape. The morning sun streamed through the eastern windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted gently as the service progressed. Pastor Rodriguez led the congregation through the familiar liturgy of the Sunday service, his voice carrying the authority and warmth that had made him a beloved figure in the Homer community. His sermon preparation that morning had focused on the theme of stewardship, particularly relevant in a community where residents lived in close contact with some of North America's most magnificent and dangerous wildlife. At 9:23 a.m., during Pastor Rodriguez's reading from Psalm 104, which spoke of God's creation of wild animals and their place in the natural order, Bear 747 began moving across the open ground between the tree line and the church parking lot. The bear's movement was deliberate and confident, showing none of the hesitation or evasive behavior typical of wild animals approaching human activity. His massive size became even more apparent in the open space, where there were no trees or structures to provide perspective. Each step covered nearly 4 feet of ground, his powerful muscles moving with the fluid grace of a predator perfectly adapted to his environment. Mary Ellen Thompson, a 34-year-old mother of 2, who had arrived late to the service with her children, was returning to her car to retrieve a forgotten children's Bible when she became the first person to see Bear 747 approaching the church grounds. Mary Ellen had grown up in Alaska and had encountered bears numerous times during camping trips and outdoor activities. But nothing had prepared her for the sight of the massive animal moving directly toward the parking lot. "I had just stepped out of the church to get Emma's Bible from our car," Mary Ellen later told investigators. "I was maybe halfway across the parking lot when I saw this enormous shape moving toward us from the trees. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The bear was so much larger than any bear I had ever seen. He was just walking straight toward the parking lot like he belonged there." Mary Ellen immediately understood the extreme danger the situation represented. With approximately 30 people inside the church building and 17 vehicles in the parking lot, the potential for tragedy was immense. Her first instinct was to protect her children, who were still inside the church with other congregation members. Instead of panicking, Mary Ellen drew upon the wilderness safety training that was common knowledge among Alaska residents. She moved slowly toward the church building, avoiding sudden movements that might attract the bear's attention, while simultaneously preparing to alert others to the danger. Her calm, measured response would prove crucial in the minutes that followed. At 9:25 a.m., Mary Ellen reached the church's main entrance and quietly opened the door, interrupting Pastor Rodriguez's sermon with an urgent but controlled whisper to the people nearest the entrance. "There's a huge bear in the parking lot," she said, her voice loud enough to be heard but calm enough to avoid panic. "Everyone needs to stay inside and stay quiet." The news rippled through the congregation with the speed of lightning, transmitted in whispers and urgent gestures that quickly reached every person in the building. Pastor Rodriguez, demonstrating the leadership qualities that had made him effective in emergency situations during his fishing career, immediately grasped the situation and began coordinating the congregation's response. "Everyone remain calm and stay seated," Pastor Rodriguez said in a voice that carried authority without panic. "We have a bear outside, and our priority is keeping everyone safe. No one should leave the building or make unnecessary noise. Bill Santos, can you check that all the doors are secure? Martha Reynolds, please gather all the children in the front pew where we can keep an eye on them." The congregation's response reflected the practical experience of people accustomed to dealing with Alaska's wildlife. Instead of panic, there was a focused attention to safety procedures that demonstrated the community's understanding of bear behavior and appropriate human responses. Parents quietly gathered their children, Adults moved to positions where they could monitor the situation, and everyone maintained the calm demeanor essential for avoiding actions that might provoke a dangerous encounter. Thomas Green, upon hearing about the bear's presence, immediately shifted into his professional mode. As the only certified wildlife expert in the building, he understood that the congregation was now looking to him for guidance and leadership. His years of experience managing human-bear encounters had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. "Pastor Rodriguez is right about staying inside," Thomas said, moving toward the windows that provided views of the parking lot. "Bears generally don't try to enter buildings, so we're safer in here than we would be outside. The most important thing is to avoid attracting the bear's attention while we assess the situation and contact authorities." Thomas approached the eastern windows carefully, positioning himself to observe the bear without creating sudden movements that might be visible from outside. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the seriousness of the situation. Bear 747 had moved to the center of the parking lot and was systematically investigating the vehicles, using his acute sense of smell to examine each car and truck for food odors or other attractants. The bear's behavior showed none of the normal wariness that wild bears display around human activity. Instead, he seemed to be claiming the area as his own territory, marking his presence by rubbing against several vehicles and leaving claw marks on metal surfaces. "This is not normal bear behavior," Thomas told the congregation, his professional training taking over as he began to analyze the situation. "A typical bear would avoid an area with this much human scent and activity. This bear seems to be actively investigating our presence, which suggests he may have lost his natural fear of humans." The implications of Thomas's assessment were serious. A bear that had lost its instinctive fear of humans represented one of the most dangerous wildlife situations possible. Such bears were unpredictable, potentially aggressive, and unlikely to retreat when confronted with human presence. The standard advice for avoiding bear encounters, making noise, appearing large, backing away slowly, might not be effective with an animal displaying this type of behavior. Martha Reynolds, the elementary school teacher who had been tasked with managing the children, had successfully gathered all 6 young people present into the front pew where they could be easily supervised. Her classroom management skills translated perfectly to the current situation, as she kept the children calm and occupied with quiet activities while the adults dealt with the emergency. "Are we going to be okay, Miss Reynolds?" asked 7-year-old Emma Thompson, Mary Ellen's daughter, who had noticed the tension among the adults despite their efforts to remain calm. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be fine," Martha replied with genuine confidence. "The grown-ups know exactly what to do, and we're safe inside the church. Sometimes wild animals come close to where people are, but they usually go away on their own when they don't find anything interesting." Martha's response reflected both her professional experience with children and her practical knowledge of Alaskan wildlife. While she was genuinely concerned about the situation, she also understood that panic among the children could complicate an already dangerous situation. Bill Santos, the commercial fisherman who had been asked to check the building's security, had completed a quick survey of all entrances and windows. The Community Covenant Church, like most buildings in Alaska, had been constructed with security in mind, featuring solid doors and windows that locked securely. However, the building had never been designed as a refuge from large predators, and several of the windows were large enough to present potential access points if the bear became determined to enter. "All the doors are locked, and the windows are secure," Bill reported to Pastor Rodriguez and Thomas. "The main entrance has a deadbolt, and the side door to the fellowship hall has a good lock too. The windows are all latched, but I'm not sure how much of a barrier they would be if the bear really wanted to get in." Thomas nodded, his mind working through the various scenarios that might develop. The good news is that bears rarely try to enter buildings unless they have a strong reason, usually food smells. Since we haven't had food in the building recently, that shouldn't be a motivating factor. The concerning thing is that this bear seems unusually bold and investigative. At 9:31 a.m., 6 minutes after Mary Ellen Thompson had first spotted the bear, Bear 747 had completed his investigation of the vehicles and was beginning to show interest in the church building itself. The bear approached the eastern wall of the church, where the large windows provided him with a clear view of the interior and the people inside. Standing on his hind legs, Bear 747 reached his full height of nearly 9 feet and pressed his front paws against the window glass. The congregation, watching from inside, could see every detail of the massive animal. His thick, dark coat with silver-tipped guard hairs, his small eyes set deep in a broad skull, and his massive paws with claws that extended well beyond his fur. The sight was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. Bear 747 represented the absolute pinnacle of North American predator evolution, a creature so perfectly adapted to survival that his species had remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. His presence at the window created a moment of profound connection between the human congregation and the wild world that surrounded their small community. Several congregation members later described the experience as transformative, a reminder of humanity's place within rather than above the natural world. The bear's eyes, visible through the glass, showed intelligence and curiosity rather than aggression, suggesting that his interest was investigative rather than predatory. Thomas Green, observing the bear's behavior from a position near the window, found himself in the unusual position of being studied by the animal he would normally be managing. "He's trying to figure out what we are," Thomas whispered to those nearby. "Bears are incredibly intelligent, and this one is displaying classic investigative behavior. He knows we're here, and he's trying to determine if we represent a threat, a food source, or something else entirely." The bear spent nearly 3 minutes examining the interior of the church through the window, his head moving slowly as he observed different areas of the building and different groups of people. His attention seemed particularly focused on the children in the front pew, possibly because their smaller size and occasional movements were more visually interesting. Pastor Rodriguez, maintaining his calm leadership throughout the encounter, had been quietly using his cell phone to contact emergency services. His call to 911 at 9:34 a.m. provided authorities with the first report of the bear's presence at the church and initiated what would become a massive emergency response operation. "This is Pastor Rodriguez at Community Covenant Church on Bayview Road," he said quietly into his phone. "We have approximately 30 people trapped inside the church by a large bear in our parking lot. The bear is currently investigating our building and showing no signs of leaving the area. We need immediate assistance from wildlife authorities." The 911 dispatcher, recognizing the extreme seriousness of the situation, immediately began coordinating responses from multiple agencies. Alaska State Troopers, Homer Police Department, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and Emergency Medical Services were all notified simultaneously, with the highest priority assigned to getting wildlife experts to the scene as quickly as possible. Sergeant Roy Thompson, who had been coordinating the response to earlier bear sightings, received the emergency dispatch at 9:36 a.m. and immediately understood that the situation had escalated to crisis level. A bear displaying bold behavior around a building containing 30 people represented the worst-case scenario for human-wildlife conflict. "All available units respond to Community Covenant Church on Bayview Road," Sergeant Thompson broadcast over the State Trooper radio network. "We have a large bear threatening multiple civilians. Approach with extreme caution and do not attempt to engage the animal until fish and game personnel are on scene." The emergency response was complicated by the remote location of available wildlife experts. The nearest fish and game biologist with tranquilizer equipment was Dr. Robert Kim, located in Anchorage, nearly 4 hours away by road. However, the Alaska State Troopers maintained emergency wildlife protocols that included basic equipment for managing dangerous animal encounters. Trooper Jake Morrison, a 15-year veteran with extensive wilderness experience, was the first law enforcement officer to reach the scene. He arrived at 9:42 a.m., parking his patrol vehicle approximately 200 yards from the church parking lot to avoid attracting the bear's attention. From his position, he could clearly observe Bear 747, who had moved away from the church windows and was now investigating the exterior of the building. "I've seen a lot of bears in my career," Trooper Morrison later reported, "but this was the largest, most confident bear I had ever encountered. He showed absolutely no concern about the vehicles, the building, or the fact that there were people nearby. That kind of behavior is extremely dangerous because it's completely unpredictable." Trooper Morrison established radio contact with Sergeant Thompson and began providing regular updates on the bear's behavior and location. His reports painted a picture of an animal that was not only unafraid of human presence, but seemed to be actively investigating the possibilities for interaction. Inside the church, the congregation had settled into what Pastor Rodriguez later described as watchful waiting. The initial fear and uncertainty had been replaced by a calm vigilance, with adults taking turns monitoring the bear's movements while others maintained normal conversation and activities to keep the children comfortable. Thomas Green had positioned himself as the primary observer, using his professional expertise to analyze the bear's behavior and provide guidance to the group. His running commentary helped the congregation understand what they were witnessing, while also preparing them for various possible developments. "The bear is showing classic territorial behavior now," Thomas observed, as Bear 747 began marking various objects around the church property. "He's rubbing against surfaces and leaving scent marks, which suggests he's claiming this area as part of his territory. That's concerning because it means he's not just passing through, he's establishing a presence here." The territorial marking behavior was indeed problematic. Bears that claimed areas near human activity often returned repeatedly, creating ongoing safety hazards and requiring eventual relocation or, in worst-case scenarios, lethal removal. The fact that Bear 747 was displaying this behavior in a location with regular human activity suggested that intervention would be necessary regardless of how the immediate situation resolved. At 9:47 a.m., Bear 747 completed his investigation of the church building and began moving back toward the parking lot. However, instead of leaving the area, he settled into a resting position near the center of the parking lot, effectively trapping the congregation inside the building and preventing anyone from reaching their vehicles. The bear's decision to remain in the area represented a significant escalation of the situation. Wildlife experts later explained that this behavior indicated the bear had decided the church grounds represented desirable territory, possibly due to the concentration of interesting scents and the lack of immediate threats to his presence. "This is not good," Thomas told the congregation. "The bear has decided to stay, which means we need to be prepared for an extended situation. We are not in immediate danger as long as we remain inside, but we also can't leave until the bear decides to move on or until wildlife authorities can safely relocate him." The prospect of an extended standoff raised new concerns about the congregation's welfare. While the church building provided adequate shelter and security, it was not equipped for a long-term occupation. There were no food supplies beyond a small emergency kit, limited water sources, and no restroom facilities adequate for 30 people over an extended period. Pastor Rodriguez, recognizing these practical concerns, began organizing the congregation for what might become a several-hour wait. "We need to think of this as an extended fellowship time," he told the group. "We have each other, we have our faith, and we have experts working to resolve the situation safely. Let's use this time to support each other and appreciate the remarkable experience we're sharing." The pastor's positive framing of the situation helped maintain morale while also acknowledging the seriousness of their circumstances. Several congregation members later credited his leadership with preventing panic and keeping the group functioning effectively as a unit. Outside, Trooper Morrison had been joined by 2 additional patrol units and a Homer Police Department officer, creating a law enforcement presence that surrounded the church property at a safe distance. The officers maintained constant visual contact with Bear 747, while coordinating with wildlife authorities to develop an intervention strategy. The first wildlife expert to reach the scene was Dr. Sarah Chen, a fish and game biologist who had been conducting research at a field station about 90 minutes from Homer. She arrived at 10:15 a.m. with basic assessment equipment, but without the specialized tranquilizer guns that would be needed for safely capturing such a large bear. Dr. Chen's initial assessment confirmed the worst fears of the law enforcement personnel on scene. "This bear is displaying extremely problematic behavior," she reported after observing the animal for 15 minutes. "He's showing territorial possession of the area, complete lack of fear around human presence, and investigative behavior that suggests he may have been food conditioned. This is a textbook dangerous bear situation. The food conditioning theory became the leading explanation for Bear 747's unusual behavior. Bears that associate human activity with food sources often lose their natural wariness and begin actively seeking out human contact. The process could be triggered by something as simple as garbage left unsecured, food dropped by campers, or well-meaning people who fed wildlife despite regulations prohibiting such activity." Dr. Chen immediately began coordinating with colleagues in Anchorage to get properly equipped personnel to Homer as quickly as possible. The distance and logistical challenges meant that the earliest arrival time for tranquilizer-equipped teams would be mid-afternoon, requiring the congregation to remain in the church for several more hours. "The good news is that the people are safe as long as they stay inside," Dr. Chen explained to the law enforcement coordinators. "The bad news is that this bear needs to be relocated immediately, and we don't currently have the resources on scene to do that safely." The waiting period that followed tested everyone's patience and nerves. Inside the church, the congregation had organized itself into an informal support system, with adults taking turns entertaining the children, monitoring the bear's behavior, and maintaining contact with authorities outside. The sense of community that had drawn many members to the church was strengthened by their shared experience of facing danger together. Thomas Green found himself in the unique position of being both a congregation member experiencing the crisis and a professional expert helping to manage it. His radio communications with the wildlife authorities outside provided crucial behavioral observations while also giving the congregation accurate information about the response efforts. Dr. Chen wants to know if anyone remembers seeing unusual bear activity in this area over the past few weeks, Thomas announced to the group. "Food conditioning doesn't happen overnight. This bear has probably been investigating human activity for some time before becoming this bold." The congregation's collective memory provided valuable information. Several members recalled seeing large paw prints in muddy areas after recent rains, and Martha Reynolds remembered that the church's dumpster had been knocked over twice in the past month, incidents that had been attributed to wind. "I saw what I thought were really big dog prints behind the fellowship hall about 2 weeks ago," recalled Harold Peterson, the elderly man who served as the church's volunteer groundskeeper. "They were way too big for any dog I knew, but I figured maybe someone's visiting relatives had a really large dog. Now I'm thinking it might have been our friend out there. The accumulation of evidence painted a picture of Bear 747 gradually becoming comfortable with the church property over several weeks. His familiarity with the area explained his confident behavior and his decision to claim the space as territory. The Bear wasn't lost or confused. He had been studying the location and had decided it met his needs. At 11:30 a.m., nearly 2 hours after Mary Ellen Thompson had first spotted the Bear, the situation took a dramatic turn. A family driving past the church, unaware of the emergency situation, pulled into the parking lot for what they assumed would be a normal Sunday service. David and Jennifer Walsh, along with their 12-year-old daughter Katie, were visiting Homer from Anchorage. And had decided to attend the Community Covenant Church based on a recommendation from friends. They were unfamiliar with the area and had no way of knowing about the Bear situation as they drove into the parking lot. Bear 747, who had been resting peacefully in the center of the parking lot, immediately rose to investigate the new arrivals. The Bear's interest in the vehicle and its occupants represented a potentially catastrophic escalation of an already dangerous situation. David Walsh, a 38-year-old accountant with limited wilderness experience, realized something was wrong when he saw the massive bear approaching his car. I saw this enormous animal walking toward us, and it took a few seconds for my brain to process that it was a bear, he later told reporters. My first thought was to protect my family, but I had no idea what the right thing to do was. Jennifer Walsh, sitting in the passenger seat, immediately grasped the severity of the situation. I told David not to get out of the car and not to make any sudden movements, she recalled. I had read enough about bear safety to know that we needed to avoid provoking the animal, but I wasn't sure what we should do beyond that. Inside the church, the congregation watched in horror as the new crisis developed. Thomas Green immediately understood that the arrival of additional people had significantly increased the danger level for everyone involved. Everyone needs to stay completely still and quiet, Thomas told the congregation. The bear is now dealing with multiple stimuli, and we don't want to add to his confusion or excitement. The people in the car are in immediate danger, but any action we take could make things worse for them. Trooper Morrison, observing the situation from his patrol vehicle, found himself facing an impossible decision. Intervening to help the Walsh family might provoke the bear and endanger the 30 people in the church. However, failing to act could result in tragedy for the family trapped in their car. This is exactly the kind of situation where someone gets killed, Trooper Morrison radioed to his colleagues. We've got multiple groups of civilians in danger, and any action we take to help one group could endanger the others. Bear 747 approached the Walsh family's Toyota Camry with the same investigative behavior he had shown toward other vehicles, but with increased intensity due to the presence of people inside. The bear rose on his hind legs and pressed his paws against the driver's side window, bringing his face within inches of David Walsh's. The family's terror was visible even from a distance. Katie Walsh, the 12-year-old daughter, began crying quietly in the back seat, while her parents tried to remain calm and avoid any movements that might attract additional attention from the bear. Dr. Chen, observing from her position outside the immediate danger zone, made a critical decision. We can't wait for the tranquilizer team, she radioed to the law enforcement coordinators. This situation is about to become a tragedy. We need to take action now. The wildlife biologist's decision to intervene immediately, rather than waiting for properly equipped personnel, reflected the rapidly deteriorating nature of the situation. With multiple groups of people in danger and a bear displaying increasingly bold behavior, the risk of waiting for ideal resources outweighed the risks of acting with limited equipment. Trooper Morrison, Dr. Chen, and two other officers began carefully positioning themselves around the parking lot, preparing to use noise and presence to encourage the bear to leave the area. Their plan was to create a coordinated distraction that would draw the bear away from both the church and the trapped family. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the coordinated intervention began. 4 officers activated their vehicle sirens simultaneously, while Dr. Chen used an air horn to create additional noise. The goal was to overwhelm the bear with sound and encourage him to retreat to the forest. The plan initially seemed to work. Bear 747, startled by the sudden cacophony of noise, moved away from the Walsh family's car and oriented toward the sources of the disturbance. For a brief moment, it appeared that the bear might retreat to the tree line and end the crisis peacefully. However, instead of retreating, Bear 747 became agitated and began displaying defensive behaviors. The bear's body language changed from curious investigation to potential aggression, with his ears flattened against his head and his shoulder muscles tensed for rapid movement. "This isn't working," Dr. Chen radioed to her colleagues. "The bear is becoming agitated rather than retreating. We need to back off before he decides to charge someone." The wildlife expert's assessment proved prescient. Bear 747, rather than being intimidated by the noise and human presence, appeared to interpret the intervention as a challenge to his claimed territory. His response demonstrated why wildlife encounters required specialized expertise and equipment, rather than improvised solutions. As the officers began to withdraw their noise-making efforts, Bear 747 made a decision that transformed the entire situation. Instead of investigating the sources of disturbance or returning to his previous activities, the bear began moving purposefully toward the church building. Thomas Green, watching from inside, immediately understood the bear's intent. "He's coming toward the building," he announced to the congregation. "Everyone move away from the windows and doors. Get to the center of the room." The congregation responded with the disciplined calm they had maintained throughout the crisis, parents gathering their children and adults, positioning themselves to provide maximum protection for the most vulnerable members of the group. The next few minutes would test everything they had learned about surviving in Alaska's wilderness. Bear 747 reached the main entrance of the church and began investigating the door with the same systematic approach he had used throughout the morning. However, his behavior now showed increased intensity and determination, suggesting that his tolerance for obstacles was decreasing. The church's main door, constructed of solid wood with decorative glass panels, represented a significant barrier, but not an absolute one. The bear's massive strength and sharp claws could potentially breach the door if he became sufficiently motivated to enter the building. "The door will hold for now," Thomas told the congregation, "but we need to be prepared for the possibility that he might try to get in. Everyone should move to the fellowship hall, which has a more secure door and fewer windows." The congregation began a quiet, orderly movement toward the church's fellowship hall, a smaller room connected to the main sanctuary by a short hallway. The fellowship hall's door was solid metal with no glass panels, and the room had only 2 small windows set high in the walls. As the people relocated, Bear 747 began applying more aggressive investigation techniques to the main door. The sounds of his claws scraping against wood and metal were clearly audible inside the building, creating an atmosphere of intense tension despite the congregation's outward calm. Pastor Rodriguez, maintaining his leadership role, began leading the group in quiet prayer, providing spiritual comfort while also helping to keep everyone focused on staying calm and quiet. The combination of faith and practical wilderness knowledge that characterized Alaska's religious communities was never more evident than during these critical minutes. Lord, we ask for your protection and wisdom, Pastor Rodriguez prayed quietly. Help us make good decisions, keep our wildlife neighbors safe, and resolve this situation without harm to anyone. We are grateful for this community and for the expertise you have given us to handle difficult situations. Outside, the emergency response had grown to include 12 law enforcement officers, 2 wildlife biologists, and emergency medical personnel standing by in case of injuries. However, the proximity of the bear to the church building made any direct intervention extremely risky. Dr. Chen, consulting by radio with colleagues in Anchorage, was receiving advice on strategies for dealing with a bear that had essentially laid siege to a building. The experts recommended patience, avoiding any actions that might further agitate the animal, and waiting for the arrival of tranquilizer equipment that was still hours away. Our best option is to wait, Dr. Chen explained to the law enforcement coordinators. The bear hasn't actually tried to break into the building. He's still just investigating. As long as the people stay quiet and out of sight, he may eventually lose interest and move on. The strategy of patience was logical from a wildlife management perspective, but it placed enormous stress on the 30 people trapped inside the church. The psychological impact of being essentially imprisoned by a dangerous predator while listening to the sounds of the animal investigating their shelter was significant. At 12:15 p.m., more than 3 hours after the crisis had begun, Bear 747 made a decision that no one had anticipated. Instead of continuing to investigate the church building or eventually losing interest and leaving, the bear settled down directly in front of the main entrance and appeared to take a nap. The bear's decision to rest at the church entrance was unprecedented in Dr. Chen's experience. I've never seen a wild bear claim territory this aggressively in such close proximity to human activity, she reported to her supervisors in Anchorage. This animal is displaying behavior that suggests he considers the church property to be his home territory. Inside the fellowship hall, the congregation faced the reality that their ordeal might continue for many more hours. The practical challenges of maintaining 30 people in a small space without adequate food, water, or restroom facilities were becoming significant concerns. Martha Reynolds, drawing on her elementary school teacher experience with managing groups of children, began organizing activities and schedules to help everyone cope with the extended confinement. We need to think of this as an adventure, she told the children. How many people get to have a story about spending a whole day at church because of a bear? The children, responding to the adults' calm leadership, began to adapt to their unusual circumstances. They created games, told stories, and even began drawing pictures of their experience. Their resilience and adaptability provided emotional support for the adults, who were struggling more with the uncertainty and potential danger of the situation. Thomas Green, meanwhile, maintained his role as the primary communicator with the outside authorities. His radio reports provided crucial information about the congregation's welfare, while also giving him access to updates about the response efforts. The tranquilizer team from Anchorage should be here by 3 p.m., Thomas announced to the group. Once they arrive, they'll be able to safely dart the bear and relocate him to a wilderness area where he won't encounter humans. We just need to maintain our patience and our discipline for a few more hours. The arrival timeline provided everyone with a concrete goal to work toward, helping to maintain morale and focus. However, the next 3 hours would test everyone's endurance and resolve as Bear 747 continued to maintain his position at the church entrance. At 1:30 p.m., the situation took another unexpected turn when the bear suddenly awakened and began moving around the church property with renewed energy. His behavior suggested increased agitation, possibly due to hunger or frustration at not finding the food sources he had expected, based on his investigation of the area. Bear 747 began systematically investigating every possible entry point to the church building, including windows, doors, and even the building's foundation. His behavior had shifted from curious investigation to determined problem-solving, suggesting that he had decided the building contained something he wanted. "This is extremely concerning behavior," Dr. Chen reported to her colleagues. "The bear is now actively trying to find a way into the building. This suggests he believes there's food inside, or he's decided that the building itself is preventing him from accessing his territory." The congregation, observing the bear's increasingly determined efforts through the small fellowship hall windows, realized that their sanctuary might not be as secure as they had hoped. The building had been designed to provide shelter from weather and security from human intruders, but it had never been tested against a determined 900-pound predator. Thomas Green, drawing on his professional experience, began developing contingency plans for various scenarios. "If the bear manages to breach the building, we need to be prepared to evacuate through alternative routes," he told the group. "The fellowship hall has an emergency exit that leads to the back of the property. If necessary, we could use that to reach the tree line and take shelter there while the bear investigates the building." The prospect of leaving the building's relative security was frightening, but Thomas's calm, professional assessment helped everyone understand their options. His years of experience managing dangerous wildlife encounters had prepared him to think strategically about survival, even in extreme circumstances. At 2:15 p.m., Bear 747's persistence finally paid off. The bear discovered that one of the fellowship hall's high windows was slightly loose in its frame, probably due to the building's age and the effects of Alaska's harsh weather cycles. Using his powerful claws and tremendous strength, the bear began working to widen the gap. The sounds of wood splintering and metal creaking were clearly audible inside the fellowship hall, creating an atmosphere of immediate urgency. The congregation realized that their secure shelter was about to be compromised by an animal that had proven to be both intelligent and persistent. "Everyone needs to prepare to evacuate through the rear exit," Thomas announced, his voice calm but urgent. "Take only essential items, stay together as a group, and follow my lead. We're going to move to the tree line behind the building and wait there for the tranquilizer team to arrive." Pastor Rodriguez, maintaining his spiritual leadership even in the face of immediate physical danger, led the congregation in a brief prayer for safety and wisdom. "Lord, guide our steps and keep us safe as we face this challenge together," he prayed. "Help us trust in your protection and in the skills and knowledge you have given us." The congregation's evacuation began just as the first pieces of window frame began to give way under Bear 747's determined assault. 30 people moved quietly and efficiently through the fellowship hall's rear exit, demonstrating the kind of coordinated response that reflected their shared experience of living in Alaska's challenging environment. Thomas Green, drawing on his wilderness survival training, led the group approximately 50 yards into the forest behind the church, selecting a position that provided concealment while maintaining visual contact with the building. The location allowed them to monitor the bear's activities while remaining out of his immediate awareness. "Everyone stay low and quiet," Thomas whispered as the group settled into their forest shelter. "Bears have excellent hearing and smell, but their eyesight isn't as good as ours. As long as we avoid making noise or sudden movements, he probably won't detect our presence here." The transition from the building's security to the vulnerability of the forest was psychologically challenging for everyone, but particularly for the children and elderly congregation members. However, the group's collective experience with Alaska's outdoors helped them adapt to their new circumstances. From their position in the trees, the congregation could see Bear 747 successfully breach the fellowship hall window and climb through the opening into the building. The sight of the massive animal disappearing into their church was both fascinating and deeply unsettling, a reminder of the power and determination of Alaska's wildlife. "He's inside now," Thomas reported quietly to the emergency coordinators via radio. "The congregation is safely relocated to the forest behind the church. The bear has full access to the building and will probably spend some time investigating the interior." Dr. Chen, monitoring the situation from her position in the parking lot, confirmed that Bear 747 had successfully entered the building and was no longer visible from outside. The wildlife expert immediately began coordinating with the approaching tranquilizer team to ensure they would be prepared for the new dynamics created by the bear's location inside the building. "Having the bear inside actually creates some advantages for us," Dr. Chen explained to her colleagues. "He's contained in a known location, and we can position ourselves strategically around the building when we're ready to deploy tranquilizers." The congregation spent the next 45 minutes in the forest, listening to the sounds of Bear 747 investigating every room of their church. The noises included furniture being moved, cabinets being opened, and what sounded like systematic exploration of every possible food source in the building. "He's being thorough," Thomas observed, translating the bear's activities for the group. "Bears are incredibly intelligent, and he's probably checking every location where food might be stored. The good news is that there isn't any significant food in the building, so he should eventually conclude that this isn't what he was looking for." At exactly 3:05 p.m., the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's emergency response team arrived from Anchorage. The team consisted of Dr. Robert Kim, the state's most experienced large animal tranquilizer specialist, along with 2 technicians and a complete array of equipment for safely capturing dangerous wildlife. Dr. Kim immediately began coordinating with the on-scene personnel to understand the current situation and develop a capture strategy. His 30 years of experience with problem bears had prepared him for complex scenarios, but the combination of a 900-pound bear inside a building with 30 civilians in the forest presented unique challenges. "The priority is getting everyone to safety," Dr. Kim explained to the assembled law enforcement and wildlife personnel. "Once the civilians are secure, we can focus on safely capturing the bear and relocating him to appropriate habitat." The specialist's arrival provided enormous relief to the congregation, who had been managing the crisis through their own resources and local expertise for more than 6 hours. Thomas Green, while highly qualified in wilderness survival and bear behavior, was grateful to transfer responsibility to someone with specific training in dangerous animal capture. Dr. Kim's first step was to establish secure transportation for the congregation away from the immediate area. School buses from the Homer School District were requisitioned to move the 30 people to a safe location where they could be interviewed by authorities, receive medical attention if needed, and contact their families. "Everyone has handled this situation with remarkable skill and composure," Dr. Kim told the congregation as they prepared to leave their forest shelter. "Your calm responses and good decision-making probably prevented what could have been a tragic outcome." The congregation's evacuation to the waiting buses was accomplished without incident, as Bear 747 remained inside the church building and showed no awareness of the human activity outside. The successful relocation of all 30 people marked the end of the immediate human safety crisis and allowed the wildlife experts to focus on the challenging task of safely capturing an extremely large bear from inside a building. As the buses carrying the congregation departed for the Homer Community Center, where they would be reunited with their families and receive support services, Bear 747 continued his systematic investigation of the Community Covenant Church. The bear's behavior inside the building would be reconstructed later through security camera footage and physical evidence, providing valuable insights into bear psychology and behavior. Dr. Kim's team spent the next 2 hours developing and implementing a capture strategy that would safely remove Bear 747 from the church without harm to the animal or damage to the building. The process involved positioning team members at strategic locations, using specialized tranquilizer equipment designed for large predators, and coordinating with construction personnel who could provide alternative exit routes if needed. The tranquilizer dart that ultimately ended Bear 747's church occupation was administered at 5:23 p.m., more than 8 hours after Mary Ellen Thompson had first spotted the bear approaching the parking lot. The dart contained a carefully calculated dose of anesthetic designed to safely immobilize an animal of Bear 747's size and physical condition. Bear 747's response to the tranquilizer was textbook perfect. The bear showed initial awareness of the dart's impact, followed by gradual disorientation and finally peaceful unconsciousness within 12 minutes of injection. Dr. Kim's team was able to safely enter the building and begin the complex process of moving a 900-pound unconscious bear. The physical logistics of removing Bear 747 from the church required specialized equipment, including a hydraulic stretcher designed for large animals, a crane truck for lifting, and a custom transport trailer that could safely contain the bear during relocation. The entire operation took nearly 4 hours, with every step carefully documented for later analysis and training purposes. Bear 747 was transported to a remote wilderness area, approximately 200 miles from Homer, in habitat that would provide abundant food sources and minimal human contact. The bear was fitted with a radio collar that would allow wildlife authorities to monitor his movements and ensure he remained in appropriate habitat. The relocation was successful from both human safety and animal welfare perspectives. Bear 747 recovered fully from the tranquilizer and adapted quickly to his new territory, showing no further interest in seeking out human contact. The radio collar monitoring confirmed that he established a normal range and behavior pattern consistent with wild brown bears in similar habitat. The investigation into the factors that led to Bear 747's unusual behavior revealed a complex combination of environmental and human factors. The bear had indeed been food conditioned through a series of seemingly minor incidents over several weeks, including unsecured garbage containers, dropped food items, and one confirmed case of illegal wildlife feeding by tourists. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the wildlife behaviorist who conducted the post-incident analysis, concluded that Bear 747's progression from normal wild behavior to dangerous human-seeking behavior illustrated the cumulative effects of food conditioning. No single incident created this situation, she explained in her report. Rather, it was the accumulation of multiple food-related associations that gradually broke down the bear's natural wariness of humans. The Community Covenant Church congregation's experience became a case study in effective emergency response to wildlife encounters. Their calm, disciplined response, combined with the presence of professional expertise within the group, prevented what could have been a tragic outcome. Thomas Green received recognition from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game for his role in managing the crisis, but he consistently deflected credit to the entire congregation. "Everyone did exactly what they needed to do," he said during the awards ceremony. "It wasn't any individual's actions that kept us safe. It was our ability to work together and support each other through a difficult situation." The incident led to enhanced wildlife safety protocols throughout the Homer area, including improved garbage storage requirements, increased public education about food conditioning prevention, and expanded coordination between wildlife authorities and local law enforcement agencies. Pastor Rodriguez used the experience as the foundation for a series of sermons about humanity's relationship with the natural world, emphasizing both the need for respect and the importance of community in facing challenges. The church's insurance company, after initial concerns about the damage caused by Bear 747's investigation, ultimately praised the congregation's response and used the case as an example of effective crisis management. The church building itself suffered only minor damage, primarily to the fellowship hall window and some interior fixtures that had been disturbed during the Bears' investigation. The congregation chose to preserve some of the claw marks as a reminder of their shared experience and the power of the natural world that surrounded their community. 6 months after the incident, Bear 747 remained successfully relocated in his wilderness habitat, showing no signs of seeking human contact or returning to his previous problem behaviors. The radio collar data indicated that he had established a normal territory and was thriving in an environment with abundant natural food sources and minimal human activity. The Homer community's response to the incident reflected Alaska's culture of self-reliance, community support, and respect for wildlife. Rather than calling for increased control measures against bears, the community focused on preventing future food conditioning incidents through improved education and waste management practices. Thomas Green continued his work as a park ranger and human-bear conflict specialist, using his experience from June 3rd to improve training programs for other wildlife professionals. His detailed incident report became required reading for wildlife management students throughout Alaska and other regions with large predator populations. The Community Covenant Church congregation, meanwhile, discovered that their shared experience had strengthened their bonds as a community. Many members described the incident as transformative, deepening their appreciation for both the natural world and the support of their fellow congregants. Mary Ellen Thompson, whose quick thinking and calm response had initiated the congregation's successful management of the crisis, became an advocate for wildlife safety education in schools. Her presentations to student groups emphasized the importance of understanding animal behavior and the value of preparation in outdoor activities. The children who had experienced the incident, rather than being traumatized by the encounter, showed increased interest in wildlife biology and conservation. Several of them began participating in local conservation programs and expressed aspirations for careers in natural resource management. Dr. Chen, the wildlife biologist who had coordinated much of the response, used the incident as the basis for research into improved techniques for managing human-bear conflicts in residential areas. Her work contributed to the development of better early warning systems and intervention protocols. The incident at Community Covenant Church ultimately demonstrated both the potential dangers and the remarkable resilience that characterized life in Alaska's wilderness communities. The congregation's experience showed that with proper knowledge, calm leadership, and community cooperation, even the most challenging wildlife encounters could be managed successfully. Bear 747, now thriving in his new wilderness home, represented both the majesty and the power of Alaska's natural world. His brief occupation of the Community Covenant Church had created a dramatic intersection between human community and wild nature, resulting in a deeper understanding of both for everyone involved. The story of June 3rd, 2024, became part of Homer's local history, told and retold as an example of how proper preparation, community cooperation, and respect for wildlife could transform a potential tragedy into a story of successful coexistence. The congregation's experience served as a reminder that in Alaska, the boundary between civilization and wilderness was never more than a heartbeat away, and survival depended on understanding and respecting that fundamental truth. As Thomas Green often said when sharing the story with visiting researchers and wildlife management students, "We weren't victims that day. We were participants in something larger than ourselves." Bear 747 taught us about the power and intelligence of Alaska's wildlife, and we learned that our community was strong enough to face that challenge together. The Community Covenant Church continued to hold services every Sunday morning at 9 a.m., with the congregation gathering in the same building where they had once sheltered from Alaska's most magnificent predator. The experience had not diminished their faith or their commitment to their community. Instead, it had deepened their understanding of their place within the larger web of life that connected all creatures in Alaska's vast wilderness. The morning sun still streamed through the eastern windows where Bear 747 had once pressed his massive paws against the glass, and Pastor Rodriguez still delivered sermons about stewardship of creation. But now those words carried the weight of lived experience, the knowledge that came from facing the raw power of nature and discovering that faith, community, and proper preparation were indeed adequate to meet such challenges. Bear 747, for his part, had returned to the ancient patterns that had sustained his species for millennia, fishing for salmon in remote streams, foraging for berries in high mountain meadows, and denning each winter in wilderness caves far from human activity. The radio collar that monitored his movements showed a bear fully adapted to wildlife, with no indication that he remembered or sought the human contact that had once made him dangerous. The intersection of their lives on June 3, 2024, had been brief but profound, creating ripple effects that would influence wildlife management practices, community emergency preparedness, and individual lives for years to come. It was a story uniquely Alaskan in its scope and character, reflecting the ongoing negotiation between human communities and the wild world that continued to define life in America's last frontier. And every Sunday morning, as the Community Covenant Church congregation gathered for worship, they were reminded of the morning when their faith had been tested not by theological questions or personal struggles, but by the simple presence of one of Alaska's most powerful predators. Their response to that test had revealed the strength of their community and the adequacy of their preparation, lessons that served them well in all aspects of life, in Alaska's challenging but magnificent wilderness. The next stories: Kodiak Bear Mall's Elderly Tour Group in Bus, October 27, 2025. The morning mist clung to the emerald slopes of Afognak Island like a shroud, its tendrils weaving through the towering Sitka spruces that had stood sentinel over these lands for centuries. Margaret Collins pressed her weathered palm against the cool window of the tour bus, her 73-year-old eyes drinking in the pristine wilderness that stretched endlessly before them. The rhythmic rumble of the diesel engine beneath her feet was a comforting constant as the vehicle navigated the narrow, winding road that carved through the heart of the Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge. "Look at that view, Harold," Margaret whispered to her husband of 52 years, nudging him gently in the ribs. Harold Collins, 76 and still sharp despite his advancing years, adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses and followed his wife's gaze toward the snow-capped peaks that pierced the October sky like ancient spears. The couple from Tucson, Arizona, had saved for 3 years to afford this Alaskan adventure, their retirement dream finally becoming reality as they journeyed through some of the most remote and beautiful wilderness in North America. Behind them, the Golden Years Adventure Tour bus carried 22 other passengers, all seniors ranging in age from 68 to 81, each with their own stories of hard work, sacrifice, and the burning desire to see the world before time ran out. The bus itself was a modified 40-foot coach, painted in cheerful yellow and blue stripes, with reinforced windows designed to provide optimal viewing while protecting passengers from the harsh Alaskan elements. Driver Bobby Nakamura, a 45-year-old native Alaskan with 20 years of experience navigating these treacherous roads, gripped the steering wheel with calloused hands as he expertly maneuvered around a particularly sharp bend. Seated in the front row, tour guide Elena Vasquez consulted her laminated itinerary for what seemed like the 100th time that morning. At 38, Elena had been leading wilderness tours for Golden Years Adventures for over a decade, and she took pride in her encyclopedic knowledge of Kodiak Island's flora, fauna, and history. Her shoulder-length black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her weathered outdoor gear spoke of countless expeditions into Alaska's untamed wilderness. She glanced at her watch, 10:47 a.m., and mentally calculated their progress along the scenic route that would eventually loop back to the town of Kodiak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena's voice crackled through the bus's intercom system, "we're currently traveling through what the Alutiiq people have called home for over 7,000 years. The dense forest you see around us is primarily composed of Sitka spruce, with some western hemlock and Pacific yew mixed throughout. This particular section of Afognak Island receives over 60 inches of rainfall annually, creating the perfect conditions for the lush, temperate rainforest ecosystem we're experiencing today." In the middle of the bus, retired schoolteacher Dorothy Hensley, 71, furiously scribbled notes in a leather-bound journal she'd brought specifically for this trip. Her late husband, Robert, had always dreamed of visiting Alaska, and Dorothy was determined to document every moment of this journey in his memory. Beside her sat Evelyn Murphy, 74, a former nurse from Portland who was celebrating her recent recovery from breast cancer with this once-in-a-lifetime adventure. The two women had struck up an immediate friendship when they discovered they both had grandchildren attending Oregon State University. Toward the back of the bus, World War II veteran James Patterson, 81, regaled anyone within earshot with stories of his service in the Pacific Theater. Despite his advanced age, James maintained the ramrod-straight posture of his military days, his piercing blue eyes still sharp and alert. His wife, Gladys, had passed away 2 years prior, and this trip represented his attempt to reconnect with the world after a long period of grief and isolation. Listening intently to James's stories were fellow passengers Frank and Betty Rodriguez, both 73, who had worked for 35 years managing a small grocery store in New Mexico before retiring to pursue their shared passion for travel and photography. The conversation throughout the bus was animated and cheerful, with passengers sharing stories of their careers, families, and previous adventures. Rose Caldwell, 68, and the youngest member of the group, was documenting the entire journey with a professional-grade camera, having worked as a freelance photographer before retirement. Her husband Paul, 72, good-naturedly endured her constant requests for him to pose in front of various scenic backdrops, their playful banter a testament to their 47 years of marriage. As the bus climbed higher into the mountains, the October air grew noticeably colder, and several passengers reached for the sweaters and jackets they'd stored in the overhead compartments. The landscape outside gradually transformed from dense forest to more open terrain, dotted with alpine meadows and rocky outcroppings. In the distance, snow-dusted peaks caught the morning sunlight, creating a breathtaking panorama that had even the most well-traveled passengers reaching for their cameras. Eleanor continued her commentary, her voice warm and engaging as she shared fascinating details about the island's unique ecosystem. Afognak Island is home to the famous Kodiak brown bear, which can weigh up to 1,500 pounds and stand over 10 feet tall on their hind legs. These magnificent creatures are actually a subspecies of grizzly bear, genetically isolated on this island chain for thousands of years. During this time of year, the bears are entering a period called hyperphagia, where they consume massive quantities of food to prepare for winter hibernation. A single bear can gain up to 400 pounds during this pre-winter feeding frenzy. At the mention of bears, several passengers exchanged excited glances and pressed closer to the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of one of Alaska's most iconic residents. Eleanor smiled at their enthusiasm, but felt compelled to add a note of caution. While bear sightings are possible, I should remind everyone that these are wild animals and should be observed only from a safe distance. The Kodiak brown bear, while generally not aggressive toward humans, can be unpredictable, especially during feeding season or when protecting cubs. Bobby Nakamura had been navigating this particular route for the better part of 2 decades, and he knew every curve, every steep grade, and every potential hazard along the way. Born and raised in the small fishing village of Akiok on the southern tip of Kodiak Island, Bobby had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about the old days, when the Alutiiq people lived in harmony with the massive brown bears that shared their island home. His grandfather, a respected elder named Thomas Nakamura, had taught Bobby to read the subtle signs of bear activity: fresh scratches on trees, disturbed vegetation, and the distinctive musky scent that could carry for miles on the wind. As they approached mile marker 47 along the remote mountain highway, Bobby noticed something that made him unconsciously grip the steering wheel a little tighter. The forest on both sides of the road showed signs of recent bear activity. Several small birch trees had been snapped at their base, their broken trunks bearing the unmistakable claw marks of a large brown bear. More concerning was the fresh scat he'd spotted beside the road, still steaming in the cool morning air, and indicating that a massive bear had passed through this area very recently. Bobby's grandfather had always told him that bears, like humans, were creatures of habit. They followed the same trails, visited the same feeding grounds, and established territories that they defended with fierce determination. The section of road they were currently traveling passed directly through what Bobby knew to be prime bear habitat, a corridor that connected the salmon-rich streams of the lower elevations with the berry-laden slopes of the alpine zones above. At 11:23 a.m., as the bus crested a small hill overlooking a beautiful alpine valley, Bobby felt the first unmistakable signs of mechanical trouble. The engine, which had been running smoothly all morning, began to develop an irregular rhythm, occasionally missing beats in a way that made Bobby's experienced ear immediately alert to potential problems. The temperature gauge on the dashboard showed a slight but noticeable increase, and Bobby could smell the faint but distinctive odor of overheating coolant beginning to permeate the vehicle's cabin. "Everything all right up there, Bobby?" Elena called from her seat, having noticed the subtle change in the engine's sound and the driver's increasingly tense posture. "Just a small issue with the cooling system," Bobby replied, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring for the passenger's benefit. "Nothing to worry about, but I'm going to pull over at the next safe spot and take a look under the hood." The next safe stopping point turned out to be a small pull-out area about 2 miles ahead, where the road widened slightly to accommodate vehicles that needed to allow faster traffic to pass. As Bobby carefully maneuvered the bus into the pull-out, the engine began to run noticeably rougher, and small wisps of steam started to rise from beneath the hood. By the time he brought the vehicle to a complete stop and engaged the parking brake, it was clear that they were dealing with a more serious mechanical problem than anyone had initially anticipated. Margaret Collins felt a flutter of anxiety as the bus came to an unexpected halt in what appeared to be the middle of nowhere. Through the windows, she could see nothing but endless wilderness stretching in every direction, with the nearest signs of human civilization completely obscured by the dense forest and rolling hills. The silence that followed the cessation of the engine was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a raven somewhere in the forest depths. Bobby stepped out of the bus to examine the engine, leaving the door open so that the passengers could hear him communicating with Elena about the situation. The coolant leak was immediately apparent. A steady drip of bright green antifreeze was forming a small puddle beneath the front of the vehicle, and the acrid smell of overheated metal filled the air around the engine compartment. "Looks like we've got a significant coolant leak," Bobby called back to Elena. "The radiator hose has developed a pretty serious rupture. I've got some emergency repair tape in my toolkit, but this is going to take some time to fix properly." Elena addressed the passengers with the calm professionalism that had made her one of Golden Year's Adventure's most popular guides. "Folks, we're experiencing some minor mechanical difficulties that our driver is working to resolve. In the meantime, this is actually a wonderful opportunity to stretch our legs and enjoy some of the most pristine wilderness that Alaska has to offer. I encourage everyone to step outside, take some photographs, and breathe in that pure mountain air." The passengers began to file off the bus with varying degrees of enthusiasm and mobility. Some, like Rose Caldwell, immediately began setting up their cameras to capture the unexpected photo opportunity, while others, including several passengers with mobility issues, remained seated and opted to simply enjoy the view from inside the climate-controlled comfort of the bus. Harold Collins helped his wife Margaret down the steep bus steps, his arthritis making the movement more challenging than it would have been in their younger years. Once outside, however, Margaret felt invigorated by the crisp mountain air and the absolutely stunning panoramic views that surrounded them on all sides. The couple walked slowly toward a nearby overlook where they could see for miles across the forested valleys and snow-capped peaks that defined this spectacular landscape. James Patterson, despite his 81 years, moved with surprising agility as he explored the immediate area around the bus. His military training had never completely left him, and he found himself automatically scanning the tree line and surrounding terrain with the trained eye of someone who had spent years in potentially hostile environments. Something about the absolute silence of the forest made him slightly uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was bothering him. Dorothy Hensley had brought her journal outside and found a comfortable spot on a fallen log where she could continue documenting her Alaskan adventure while Bobby worked on the engine repairs. She wrote in careful, precise handwriting about the unexpected stop, the breathtaking scenery, and her thoughts about how much her late husband Robert would have loved to experience this moment with her. Unknown to the passengers and crew of the tour bus, they were being watched from the shadows of the dense forest that surrounded the pull-out area. A massive male Kodiak brown bear, weighing approximately 1,200 pounds and measuring nearly 9 feet from nose to tail, had been following the scent trail of garbage and food odors that emanated from the tour bus. The bear, which wildlife biologists would later designate as bear, greater than 347 in their research database, was a dominant adult male in the prime of his life, with the characteristic silver-tipped fur and massive shoulder hump that distinguished his species. Bear greater than 347 had been born 15 years earlier in a den high on the slopes of Mount Glotov, the offspring of a legendary sow known to researchers as Big Bertha, who had successfully raised 23 cubs during her 30-year lifespan. Like his mother before him, greater than 347 had grown to enormous proportions by taking advantage of every available food source on the island, from the protein-rich salmon runs that occurred each summer to the vast berry patches that carpeted the alpine meadows each fall. This particular bear had limited experience with humans, having spent most of his life in the remote interior regions of Afognak Island, where human activity was minimal. However, recent encroachment of hiking trails and increased tourism in his traditional territory had begun to familiarize him with the scents and sounds associated with human presence. Unlike many bears that learned to avoid human contact, greater than 347 had developed a curious and potentially dangerous association between humans and readily available food sources. The bear had first detected the tour bus nearly 20 minutes before it had stopped at the pullout, following the vehicle's progress along the mountain road by tracking the distinctive diesel exhaust and the complex mixture of human scents that surrounded the large group of passengers. When the bus had pulled over and the passengers had begun to exit the vehicle, 347 had positioned himself approximately 150 yards away in a dense thicket of alders and devil's club, where his dark brown fur provided perfect camouflage against the shadows of the forest understory. From his concealed position, the bear watched the humans with a mixture of curiosity and growing interest. His extraordinarily acute sense of smell, estimated to be 7 times more sensitive than that of a bloodhound, detected not only the natural human scents, but also the lingering aromas of the packed lunches, snacks and beverages that many of the passengers had brought along for their day-long tour. Most intriguing to the bear was the smell of fried chicken, fresh fruit, and chocolate chip cookies that Rose Caldwell had packed in her day pack for her and her husband Paul to share during their journey. As Bobby Nakamura worked beneath the hood of the bus, using emergency repair tape and clamps to temporarily seal the ruptured radiator hose, he remained completely unaware of the massive predator that was studying the group from the forest shadows. His focus was entirely concentrated on the mechanical problem at hand, and the constant chatter and movement of the passengers masked any subtle sounds that might have indicated the presence of wildlife in the immediate area. Elena Vasquez had positioned herself near the center of the passenger group, continuing to provide educational commentary about the local ecosystem while keeping a watchful eye on the more adventurous passengers who had wandered farther from the bus to take photographs or simply enjoy the scenery. Her wilderness training had taught her to be constantly aware of potential hazards, but like Bobby, she was focused primarily on managing the human elements of the situation rather than scanning for wildlife threats. The bear remained motionless in his hiding place for nearly 30 minutes, his small but intelligent eyes tracking the movement of individual passengers as they moved around the area. His patience was that of a supreme predator. He had once waited motionless for over 4 hours beside a salmon stream, timing his attack to coincide with the precise moment when a large Chinook salmon would be vulnerable to capture. At 12:15 p.m., as Bobby was making final adjustments to his temporary repair job, the bear made his first tentative movement toward the human group. Moving with the silent grace that allowed 1,200-pound predators to approach prey without detection, greater than 347 began to slowly circle the pullout area, using the dense vegetation as cover while he evaluated the potential threat and opportunity presented by this unprecedented gathering of humans in his territory. Margaret Collins was the first to sense that something was amiss, though she couldn't immediately identify the source of her unease. As she stood beside her husband Harold at the scenic overlook, taking in the magnificent mountain vistas, she felt an inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the October temperature. The forest around them had become unnaturally quiet. The ravens that had been calling just minutes earlier had fallen silent, and even the constant whisper of wind through the trees seemed to have diminished to an almost eerie calm. "Harold," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible, "do you notice how quiet it's gotten?" Harold paused in his photography and listened carefully to the sounds around them. His hearing, while not as sharp as it had been in his younger years, still registered the subtle change in the forest's ambient noise level. "You're right, dear. Even the birds have stopped singing." What neither Margaret nor Harold realized was that they were experiencing one of nature's most reliable warning signs: the sudden silence that occurs when prey animals detect the presence of a large predator in their environment. Every bird, squirrel, and small mammal within a quarter-mile radius of the bear's position had instinctively ceased all unnecessary activity, their survival instincts triggered by subtle chemical signals and vibrations that indicated danger was near. James Patterson, with his military-trained situational awareness, was the next to notice the change in the forest's atmosphere. As he examined some interesting rock formations about 50 yards from the bus, he felt the familiar sensation of being watched that had saved his life more than once during his service in the Pacific Theater. The feeling was unmistakable, a primitive warning system that evolution had hardwired into the human nervous system over millions of years of survival in environments where humans were potential prey. James stopped his exploration and slowly turned in a complete circle, carefully scanning the tree line for any sign of movement or anything that seemed out of place. His aging eyes weren't as sharp as they'd once been, but his ability to detect anomalies in natural patterns remained keen. For just a moment, he thought he caught a glimpse of something large and dark moving among the shadows beneath a cluster of ancient spruces, but when he focused his attention on that specific area, he saw nothing but the normal interplay of light and shadow created by the forest canopy. Meanwhile, Bear greater than 347 had completed nearly half of his reconnaissance circle around the human group. His route took him through terrain that he knew intimately. Every fallen log, every dense thicket, every natural corridor that would allow him to move without being detected. The bear's approach was methodical and intelligent, demonstrating the sophisticated hunting strategies that had allowed his species to dominate the Alaskan ecosystem for thousands of years. As the bear moved closer to the pull-out area, the complex mixture of human scents became increasingly intense and intriguing. His powerful olfactory system could distinguish between individual passengers, identifying not only their personal scents, but also the various foods, cosmetics, medications, and other items they carried. Most compelling was the growing intensity of food odors that seemed to be concentrated around the tour bus itself. Rose Caldwell had opened her day pack to retrieve a different camera lens, and the simple act of unzipping the pack had released a concentrated burst of food aromas into the surrounding air. The fried chicken, fresh apples, and homemade cookies that she'd carefully packed that morning now served as an irresistible attractant to a massive predator that was operating purely on instinct and opportunity. At 12:28 p.m., Bobby Nakamura straightened up from his work beneath the hood and wiped his hands on a shop rag with obvious satisfaction. "That should hold us," he called out to Elena. "The temporary repair isn't pretty, but it'll get us back to town safely. We should probably head out as soon as everyone's back on board." Elena began the process of gathering the passengers and encouraging them to return to the bus. "Ladies and gentlemen, our driver has successfully completed the repairs and will be continuing our tour shortly. Please begin making your way back to the bus so we can get back on schedule." The passengers began to slowly converge on the bus, some reluctantly leaving their photographic opportunities, while others were eager to return to the warmth and comfort of the heated interior. Margaret and Harold Collins were among the last to respond to Elena's call, having become completely absorbed in documenting the spectacular mountain scenery with their camera. It was at this precise moment, as the human group was at its most vulnerable during the transition from exploration back to the safety of the bus, that bear greater than 347 made his decision to approach. The bear had determined that the humans posed no immediate threat to him, and the increasingly powerful food odors had triggered his hyperphagia-driven feeding instincts to override his natural caution. The bear's initial approach was not aggressive in the traditional sense. He was investigating rather than attacking, driven by curiosity and hunger rather than territorial aggression or maternal protection. However, the distinction between investigation and aggression means little when the investigator weighs 1,200 pounds and possesses claws longer than a man's fingers and canine teeth designed to crush the bones of large prey animals. Dorothy Hensley was sitting on her log, putting the finishing touches on a particularly detailed journal entry, when she became aware of a large, dark shape moving at the edge of her peripheral vision. She looked up from her writing with the casual interest of someone expecting to see perhaps another passenger, or possibly a deer, and found herself staring directly into the small, intelligent eyes of the largest animal she had ever encountered outside of a zoo. The bear was approximately 30 yards away, having emerged from the forest with the silent efficiency that made him such an effective predator. He stood motionless for several seconds, his massive head swinging slowly from side to side as he evaluated this new situation. Dorothy's brain struggled to process what she was seeing. The animal was so much larger than she had ever imagined possible. His silver-tipped fur catching the afternoon sunlight and his enormous shoulder muscles rippling beneath his thick coat. For what seemed like an eternity, but was actually only 3 or 4 seconds, woman and bear regarded each other in absolute silence. Dorothy's survival instincts, dormant for 7 decades of suburban living, suddenly awakened with crystalline clarity. Every cell in her body screamed that she was in mortal danger, but her conscious mind couldn't quite accept the reality of the situation. This wasn't supposed to happen. Bears attacked people in movies and news stories, not during carefully planned retirement tours with professional guides and experienced drivers. The spell was broken when Dorothy's journal slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers and hit the ground with a soft thud. The bear's ears immediately swiveled toward the sound, and his posture shifted subtly from casual investigation to focused attention. In that instant, Dorothy found her voice and released a scream that carried across the pull-out area with the piercing intensity of pure terror. "Bear! There's a bear!" Her scream galvanized every person in the area into immediate action, though not all of their responses were helpful to their survival. Rose Caldwell, who had been bent over her camera bag near the rear of the bus, straightened up quickly and began frantically photographing the bear, her photographer's instincts overriding her sense of self-preservation. James Patterson immediately began moving toward the bus with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to responding quickly to dangerous situations. Margaret and Harold Collins, who had been farthest from the bus when Dorothy screamed, found themselves suddenly isolated and exposed as the bear's attention shifted toward the general area where most of the passengers were now converging in panic. Harold grabbed his wife's hand and began pulling her toward the bus as quickly as their aging legs could carry them, but their progress was frustratingly slow compared to the fluid, powerful movement of the massive predator. Elena Vasquez felt her stomach drop as she spotted the bear and instantly understood the gravity of their situation. Her wilderness training kicked in, and she began shouting instructions to the passengers while simultaneously reaching for the can of bear spray attached to her belt. "Everyone move slowly toward the bus. Do not run. Do not make sudden movements. Stay calm and back away slowly." But her professional advice was largely lost in the chaos that had erupted around the pull-out area. Most of the passengers, many of whom had never encountered a truly dangerous wild animal in their entire lives, were operating purely on panic and instinct. Frank Rodriguez attempted to position himself between the bear and his wife Betty, despite weighing less than half what the bear's front paw weighed. Evelyn Murphy and Paul Caldwell were helping each other toward the bus, their mutual support barely keeping both of them upright as they struggled across the uneven ground. Bobby Nakamura, who had been cleaning his tools when Dorothy's scream shattered the afternoon quiet, looked up to see a sight that made his blood run cold. The bear was now moving purposefully toward the group of panicking seniors, his massive form covering ground with deceptively smooth strides that belied his incredible speed. Bobby had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories about bear encounters, and he knew that the situation had already progressed beyond the point where passive avoidance would be sufficient. The bear's demeanor had shifted dramatically in response to the sudden explosion of movement, noise, and panic around him. What had begun as a curious investigation of interesting smells and sounds had now triggered his predatory instincts. The running, screaming humans had activated prey behaviors that millions of years of evolution had programmed him to pursue and overwhelm. Bear greater than 347 broke into a loping run that covered the 30 yards between his position and the cluster of passengers in less than 5 seconds. His target was not specifically chosen. He was simply pursuing the nearest source of movement and commotion, which happened to be Dorothy Hensley, who was still sitting on her log in a state of shock, unable to force her 71-year-old legs to carry her to safety. The bear's charge was a terrifying display of raw power and speed. Despite weighing over half a ton, he moved with the fluid grace of a much smaller animal, his massive paws striking the ground with enough force to send small rocks and dirt flying with each stride. His head was lowered slightly, his ears pinned back against his skull, and his lips were pulled back to reveal canine teeth that were longer than a human thumb and designed to puncture and hold struggling prey. Dorothy finally managed to stand and began stumbling toward the bus, but her movement was unsteady and slow compared to the approaching predator. She had made it perhaps 10 feet when the bear reached her, his massive form seeming to block out the sun as he reared up on his hind legs directly behind her. The attack, when it came, was swift and devastating. The bear's front paws, each equipped with 5 curved claws measuring up to 4 inches in length, struck Dorothy across her back and shoulders with enough force to knock her to the ground instantly. The impact alone would have been sufficient to seriously injure a person half her age, but the claws that accompanied the blow opened 4 parallel gashes through her heavy jacket, sweater, and into the flesh beneath. Dorothy's second scream was different from her first. Where the initial cry had been pure terror, this sound contained the unmistakable note of physical agony. She hit the ground hard, her journal flying from her hands to scatter loose pages across the rocky surface of the pull-out area. The bear immediately pinned her to the ground with one massive paw, while his powerful jaws closed around her left shoulder, his teeth easily penetrating her multiple layers of clothing and sinking deep into the muscle and tissue beneath. The sound of the attack was unlike anything the other passengers had ever heard. A combination of Dorothy's screams, the bear's huffing and growling, and the terrible ripping sound of fabric and flesh being torn. Margaret Collins, who had been watching in horror from near the bus, felt her knees buckle as the reality of what was happening overwhelmed her to process the situation. Elena Vasquez had managed to reach her bear spray and was attempting to get close enough to the bear to use it effectively, but the animal's positioning over Dorothy made it impossible to spray the bear without also affecting the victim. She was shouting instructions that no one could hear over the noise of the attack and the screaming of the other passengers, while simultaneously trying to reach Bobby to coordinate some kind of response. James Patterson had reached the bus and was frantically searching for anything that could be used as a weapon or distraction device. His military experience had taught him that in life-or-death situations, action was always preferable to paralysis, even if the action seemed inadequate to the challenge at hand. He grabbed a hiking pole that belonged to one of the passengers and began moving back toward the bear, despite Elena's shouted warnings for him to stay back. The bear's attack on Dorothy continued for what seemed like hours, but was actually less than 60 seconds. His powerful jaws maintained their grip on her shoulder, while his claws raked across her back and arms, opening multiple wounds that immediately began bleeding profusely. Dorothy's movements became increasingly weak as shock and blood loss began to take their toll, her screams diminishing to weak moans and gasps. It was at this moment that the bear's attention was diverted by a new source of movement and commotion. Rose Caldwell, in her panic to document the attack, had moved closer to get better photographs and had inadvertently positioned herself between the bear and the bus. When she realized her mistake and began backing away rapidly, she tripped over her camera bag and fell backward, landing hard on the rocky ground with her camera equipment scattering around her. The bear immediately released Dorothy and spun toward this new disturbance, his primitive brain interpreting Rose's fall and the clatter of equipment as either a threat or another prey opportunity. Rose found herself looking up at 1,200 pounds of enraged predator from a distance of less than 10 feet, with no protection other than her scattered camera gear and no escape route that wouldn't require her to turn her back on the animal. Paul Caldwell, seeing his wife in immediate danger, did something that was both incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. Despite being 72 years old and having no experience with dangerous animals, he charged toward the bear while screaming at the top of his lungs and waving his jacket above his head. His goal was not to fight the bear, but simply to distract it long enough for Rose to escape. But his heroic gesture had the unintended consequence of further escalating the bear's aggressive response. The bear's attention shifted again, this time toward Paul, whose aggressive display and rapid approach had triggered the animal's defensive instincts. Rather than treating Paul as prey, the bear now perceived him as a competing predator or territorial threat, which prompted an even more violent response than his attack on Dorothy had generated. Bear, greater than 347, charged Paul with the full fury of a dominant predator defending his claim to a food source. The bear's speed was breathtaking. Paul had taken perhaps 3 steps toward the animal when 1,200 pounds of muscle and fury struck him with the force of a small automobile. The impact lifted Paul completely off his feet and sent him flying backward several yards before he struck the ground with bone-jarring force. Before Paul could even attempt to regain his footing, the bear was on top of him, using his massive weight to pin the elderly man to the ground, while his jaws sought the most efficient way to neutralize this perceived threat. Paul's screams joined Dorothy's in creating a hellish symphony of human suffering that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Elena had finally gotten close enough to deploy her bear spray, but the afternoon wind was blowing from the wrong direction, carrying much of the pepper spray's effectiveness away from the bear and toward the human victims. The small amount that did reach the bear's face seemed to have minimal effect on the enraged animal, serving only to further escalate his aggressive behavior. Bobby Nakamura had been shouting into his radio, trying to raise emergency services on the limited communication frequencies available in this remote area. The nearest ranger station was over 40 miles away, and the local emergency response capabilities were limited to a small helicopter that would require at least 30 minutes to reach their location, assuming it was even available for immediate dispatch. James Patterson reached the area of the attack carrying the hiking pole like a spear, but the reality of confronting a 1,200-pound predator with a piece of aluminum tubing quickly became apparent. Nevertheless, he began jabbing at the bear's flanks and hindquarters, hoping to distract or annoy the animal sufficiently to give Paul a chance to escape from beneath its massive bulk. The bear's response to James's intervention was swift and devastating. Without releasing his grip on Paul, the bear swept one massive paw toward James, catching the elderly veteran across the chest and sending him tumbling across the rocky ground. The hiking pole splintered like a toothpick, and James felt at least 2 of his ribs crack from the impact of the bear's claws raking across his torso. At this point, the situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of civilian intervention being effective. 3 passengers were down and injured. The bear was in a state of full aggressive arousal, and the remaining passengers were trapped between the attacking predator and the limited safety offered by the tour bus. Margaret Collins had collapsed near the bus steps, her heart racing dangerously as the stress of witnessing the ongoing carnage pushed her cardiovascular system beyond its limits. Harold Collins, despite his 76 years and arthritic joints, attempted to help his wife while simultaneously trying to process the nightmare that was unfolding before his eyes. The cheerful retirement adventure they had planned and saved for had transformed into a scene from their worst nightmares, and the gentle, docile animal they had hoped to photograph from a safe distance had revealed itself to be a killing machine of terrifying efficiency. The bear had now been actively attacking for approximately 4 minutes, and his aggression showed no signs of diminishing. Dorothy Hensley lay motionless near her scattered journal pages, her breathing shallow and her clothing soaked with blood from multiple wounds. Paul Caldwell was still pinned beneath the bear's massive weight, his movements growing weaker as shock and trauma took their toll on his 72-year-old body. Bobby Nakamura made a decision that probably saved the lives of everyone who survived the attack. Rather than continuing to wait for emergency services that were still 25 minutes away at best, he started the bus engine and began driving the vehicle directly toward the bear. His plan was to use the bus itself as a weapon, hoping that the noise and size of the approaching vehicle would either drive the bear away or provide sufficient distraction for the injured passengers to be rescued. The sound of the bus engine roaring to life and the sight of the large vehicle moving toward him finally penetrated the bear's aggressive focus. For the first time since the attack had begun, Bear greater than 347 looked up from his victims and evaluated this new threat to his dominance of the situation. The bus represented something far larger than himself, and even in his aroused state, millions of years of evolutionary caution warned him that discretion might be the better part of valor. Bobby brought the bus to within 10 feet of the bear before applying the brakes, laying on the horn and revving the engine to create as much noise and intimidation as possible. Elena had positioned herself at the open bus door with her bear spray ready, while several of the male passengers had armed themselves with whatever improvised weapons they could find, cameras, walking sticks, and even heavy boots that could be thrown if necessary. The bear's decision to withdraw was not immediate. He continued to guard his position over Paul Caldwell for several more tense seconds while evaluating whether this new threat warranted abandoning his current activities. Finally, the combination of the bus's proximity, the continuing noise, and perhaps the diminished novelty of the attack situation convinced him to release Paul and back away from the immediate area. Bear greater than 347's withdrawal was not a panicked retreat, but rather a strategic repositioning to a location where he could continue to monitor the situation while remaining ready to resume his attack if the opportunity presented itself. He moved approximately 50 yards away from the immediate attack site, but remained clearly visible among the sparse vegetation, his massive form a constant reminder that the danger was far from over. The next few minutes were a frantic effort to get the 3 injured passengers onto the bus and begin emergency first aid while preparing for the possibility that the bear might resume his attack. Dorothy Hensley was unconscious and had lost a significant amount of blood from her shoulder and back wounds. Paul Caldwell was conscious but in severe shock, with multiple lacerations and what appeared to be internal injuries from being crushed beneath the bear's weight. James Patterson was mobile, but had suffered significant chest injuries and was having difficulty breathing. Elena's wilderness first aid training proved invaluable as she coordinated the evacuation and treatment of the injured passengers. Her primary concern was controlling bleeding and preventing further shock while maintaining constant watch for any sign that the bear was preparing to renew his attack. Bobby kept the bus engine running and positioned the vehicle to provide maximum protection for the evacuation effort. The process of getting Dorothy onto the bus required 4 passengers working together to lift her carefully while Eleanor applied pressure to her worst wounds. Paul was able to walk with assistance, though his gait was unsteady and he required constant support to remain upright. James, despite his injuries, insisted on helping with the evacuation effort, his military training having taught him that everyone contributes according to their ability, regardless of their personal condition. Once all 3 injured passengers were aboard the bus, Bobby began the careful process of driving away from the attack site, while Elena maintained radio contact with emergency services to coordinate a meeting point where the injured could be transferred to more advanced medical care. The bear remained visible in their mirrors for several miles, apparently following the bus along the road before finally disappearing back into the forest depths. The 40-minute drive back to the town of Kodiak was a harrowing experience for everyone on the bus. Dorothy's condition continued to deteriorate, despite Elena's best efforts to control her bleeding and maintain her airway. Paul drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as potential internal bleeding and shock progressed. James remained alert and coherent, but the visible effort required for him to breathe indicated that his chest injuries were more serious than initially apparent. Margaret Collins had stabilized somewhat during the evacuation, but the stress of the attack had triggered what appeared to be a cardiac episode that required constant monitoring. Harold remained at her side, holding her hand and speaking quietly to her while trying to process his own emotional trauma from witnessing the savage attack on their fellow passengers. The other passengers dealt with their trauma in various ways. Some, like Frank and Betty Rodriguez, sat in stunned silence, staring out the windows as if they couldn't quite believe what they had just experienced. Others, including Evelyn Murphy, threw themselves into helping Elena care for the injured, finding that action helped them cope with their own shock and fear. Rose Caldwell had managed to retain her camera throughout the entire ordeal, and the photographs she had taken during the attack would later prove crucial to the investigation into the incident. However, in the immediate aftermath, she was struggling with severe guilt over her decision to continue photographing rather than immediately seeking safety, and her husband Paul's injuries were a constant reminder of the price paid for her artistic dedication. When the bus finally reached the outskirts of Kodiak, they were met by a convoy of emergency vehicles, including 2 ambulances, a helicopter medical team, and representatives from both the Alaska State Troopers and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The transfer of the injured passengers to professional medical care was swift and efficient, but the critical nature of their injuries was immediately apparent to the paramedics and emergency room staff. Dorothy Hensley was airlifted to the Regional Trauma Center in Anchorage, where a team of surgeons worked for over 6 hours to repair the extensive damage to her shoulder, back, and arms. The bear's claws had severed multiple muscle groups and caused significant nerve damage that would require months of rehabilitation to address. More critically, she had lost nearly 30% of her blood volume during the attack and evacuation, pushing her elderly cardiovascular system to the brink of complete failure. Paul Caldwell was also transported to Anchorage, where imaging studies revealed extensive internal injuries, including a ruptured spleen, 3 broken ribs, and significant bruising to his kidneys and liver. The surgeons were able to repair the spleen damage, but the overall trauma to his 72-year-old body created complications that would keep him in intensive care for over 2 weeks. James Patterson was treated at the local Kodiak hospital for his chest injuries, which included 2 fractured ribs and significant soft tissue damage from the bear's claws. His military conditioning and overall fitness probably saved his life, as a person in worse physical condition might not have survived the massive blow he had received from the bear's paw. The investigation into the bear attack began immediately, with wildlife officials working to determine what factors had contributed to the unprecedented level of aggression displayed by bear greater than 347. Initial evidence suggested that the bear had been following the tour bus for some time before the mechanical breakdown forced the passengers to leave the safety of their vehicle, and that the combination of easily accessible food odors and the vulnerable group of humans had created a perfect storm for disaster. Within 24 hours of the attack, a team of wildlife managers had located and destroyed bear greater than 347 using helicopters and high-powered rifles. The decision to kill the bear was controversial, but considered necessary due to the animal's demonstrated willingness to attack humans and the risk he posed to other wilderness users in the area. The bear's stomach contents revealed fragments of the victim's clothing, confirming that he had indeed been feeding on the human victims during the attack. The necropsy performed on bear greater than 347 revealed several important details about the attack. The bear was in excellent physical condition, with no signs of injury, disease, or malnutrition that might have explained his aggressive behavior. His weight was estimated at 1,247 pounds, making him one of the largest Kodiak bears ever documented. Most significantly, his brain showed no signs of rabies or other neurological conditions that might have caused abnormal aggression. Wildlife biologists concluded that the attack was the result of a combination of factors, including the bear's natural curiosity, the strong food odors emanating from the tour group, the vulnerable positioning of the passengers during the mechanical breakdown, and the panic response that had triggered the bear's predatory instincts. The attack was classified as predatory rather than defensive, which made it particularly unusual and concerning for future wilderness safety protocols. The media coverage of the attack was extensive and often sensationalized, with news outlets around the world picking up the story of the killer bear that had attacked a bus full of senior citizens in the Alaskan wilderness. The dramatic photographs taken by Rose Caldwell during the attack provided visual documentation that was both compelling and disturbing, leading to widespread debate about the wisdom of wildlife tourism in areas populated by large predators. For the survivors of the attack, the psychological trauma proved to be as challenging as the physical injuries sustained by the victims. Margaret Collins suffered a mild heart attack 2 days after the incident and required cardiac surgery to address the stress-related damage to her cardiovascular system. The couple's dream retirement trip to Alaska had turned into a nightmare that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Harold Collins found himself dealing with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress that manifested in panic attacks whenever he encountered news stories about bears or wilderness travel. The man who had spent his entire career as a calm, rational engineer found himself unable to sleep without medication and unable to venture outdoors without experiencing severe anxiety. The other passengers struggled with their own forms of trauma. Frank Rodriguez developed agoraphobia and became unable to leave his house for several months after returning home to New Mexico. Betty Rodriguez threw herself into caring for her husband, but privately struggled with intrusive memories of Dorothy's screams and the sight of Paul being crushed beneath the massive bear. Evelyn Murphy, who had been celebrating her recovery from cancer with the Alaska trip, found that surviving the bear attack gave her a new perspective on mortality and the randomness of fate. Her nursing background had helped her assist Elena during the emergency treatment of the victims, but she was haunted by the memory of Dorothy's injuries and the realization of how quickly a pleasant vacation could transform into a life-threatening disaster. Rose and Paul Caldwell's marriage was significantly strained by the aftermath of the attack. Rose struggled with guilt over her decision to continue photographing rather than immediately seeking safety, while Paul dealt with ongoing physical complications from his injuries that prevented him from returning to many of the activities they had enjoyed together. The photographs Rose had taken during the attack became a source of both pride and horror. They were valuable documentation of the incident, but viewing them brought back traumatic memories of the moment when her husband was nearly killed. Bobby Nakamura found himself at the center of an investigation into whether the tour company had taken adequate safety precautions for wilderness travel in known bear habitat. His quick thinking in using the bus to drive off the bear was credited with saving lives, but questions were raised about whether the group should have been allowed to exit the vehicle in such a remote location, regardless of the mechanical problems they were experiencing. Elena Vasquez faced the most professional scrutiny, as her role as tour guide made her responsible for the safety and decision-making that had led to the passengers being exposed to attack. Her wilderness training and emergency response during the crisis were exemplary, but the fact that the attack had occurred at all raised questions about whether the tour group should have remained in the bus, regardless of the mechanical issues. The Golden Years Adventure Tour Company faced multiple lawsuits from passengers and their families, with claims ranging from inadequate safety protocols to negligent exposure to known hazards. The company's insurance coverage was adequate to handle the medical expenses and compensation claims, but the reputation damage proved to be insurmountable, and the business closed permanently 6 months after the attack. Dorothy Hensley's recovery was the most challenging of all the victims. The 71-year-old retired teacher spent 3 months in various hospitals and rehabilitation facilities, undergoing multiple surgeries to repair the damage to her shoulder and back. The nerve damage caused by the bear's claws resulted in permanent partial paralysis of her left arm, and the psychological trauma of the attack left her unable to venture outdoors without experiencing severe panic attacks. Her journal, which had been scattered across the pullout area during the attack, was recovered by investigators and returned to her family. The final entry, written just minutes before the bear appeared, described her excitement about the beautiful wilderness and her wish that her late husband Robert could have shared the experience with her. The contrast between her joyful anticipation and the horror that followed made the journal particularly poignant for her surviving family members. Paul Caldwell's recovery was complicated by ongoing internal injuries that required additional surgeries and extended rehabilitation. The 72-year-old had always been active and independent, but the attack left him with chronic pain and reduced mobility that fundamentally changed his quality of life. His heroic attempt to save his wife Rose was recognized by several organizations, but he struggled with depression and the feeling that his sacrifice had been inadequate to protect her from the trauma of the experience. James Patterson, despite being the oldest victim at 81, had the most successful recovery of the 3 injured passengers. His military conditioning and overall fitness enabled him to heal more quickly than medical professionals had initially expected, and his experience with combat situations helped him process the psychological trauma more effectively than the other victims. He became an advocate for improved wilderness safety protocols and spoke publicly about the need for better preparation and equipment when traveling in areas populated by large predators. The investigation into the attack led to significant changes in wilderness tour safety protocols throughout Alaska. Tour companies were required to carry more sophisticated bear deterrent equipment, including larger canisters of bear spray and noise-making devices designed to discourage bear approaches. Guides were required to complete more extensive wilderness safety training, and tour groups were prohibited from leaving their vehicles in certain high-risk areas, regardless of mechanical or other issues. The specific pull-out area where the attack occurred was permanently closed to tourist access and posted with warning signs about the presence of aggressive bears in the immediate vicinity. Wildlife managers increased their monitoring of bear activity along the scenic route and established protocols for temporarily closing roads when bears were observed in close proximity to areas frequented by tourists. 1 year after the attack, a memorial service was held for Dorothy Hensley, who had died from complications related to her injuries 6 months after the incident. Her family established a scholarship fund for students studying wildlife management, with the goal of improving human-bear coexistence through better understanding of predator behavior and improved safety protocols. Paul Caldwell died 14 months after the attack. His death attributed to complications from the internal injuries he had sustained during the bear's assault. His funeral was attended by all of the surviving passengers from the tour, many of whom had maintained contact throughout their recoveries and had formed bonds forged by their shared trauma. The photographs taken by Rose Caldwell during the attack were eventually published in a wildlife management journal as part of a comprehensive study of predatory bear behavior. The images provided unprecedented documentation of a bear attack in progress and contributed to scientific understanding of the factors that trigger predatory responses in large bears. However, Rose never recovered emotionally from the guilt of having prioritized her photography over immediate safety, and she required ongoing psychological counseling for the remainder of her life. The tour bus involved in the attack was retired from service and eventually sold to a scrap dealer, but not before investigators had conducted extensive analysis of the vehicle's mechanical failure and the events that had led to the passengers being exposed to attack. The investigation concluded that the radiator hose failure was the result of normal wear and tear rather than any mechanical negligence, and that Bobby Nakamura's temporary repair had been competently executed under difficult circumstances. Bear greater than 347's remains were preserved by wildlife biologists for ongoing research into the factors that influence bear aggression toward humans. The animal's size, physical condition, and brain structure provided valuable data for scientists studying predator behavior, and tissue samples were used in genetic research aimed at understanding the evolutionary factors that had produced such large and powerful bears on the Kodiak Island chain. The attack had lasting impacts on wildlife management policies throughout Alaska and other areas populated by large predators. The incident demonstrated that even experienced wilderness guides and well-prepared tour groups could find themselves in life-threatening situations when mechanical failures or other unforeseen circumstances exposed them to predator encounters. The tragedy led to the development of new emergency protocols, improved communication systems for remote areas, and more sophisticated bear deterrent technologies. Margaret Collins never fully recovered from the cardiac complications triggered by the stress of witnessing the attack. She required ongoing medical care for heart conditions that had been exacerbated by the trauma, and she and Harold moved from their Arizona home to be closer to their children in California. Harold became her primary caregiver, but the couple's golden years were forever marked by the memory of the day their dream vacation had turned into a nightmare that claimed the lives of 2 fellow passengers and left them both psychologically scarred. The Golden Years Adventure Tour attack, as it came to be known in wildlife management circles, remains one of the most thoroughly documented predatory bear attacks in North American history. The combination of multiple witness accounts, photographic documentation, and extensive post-incident investigation provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the factors that can transform a routine wildlife encounter into a deadly assault. The legacy of the attack continues to influence wilderness safety protocols and tour group management throughout North America. The incident serves as a sobering reminder that the natural world, despite its beauty and appeal to human visitors, operates according to laws and instincts that can be utterly indifferent to human welfare and survival. The massive Kodiak brown bears that had inspired awe and excitement in the tour group passengers proved to be apex predators whose power and unpredictability demanded a level of respect and caution that even experienced professionals had underestimated. For the families of Dorothy Hensley and Paul Caldwell, the attack represented the ultimate irony of retirement travel. The pursuit of lifelong dreams and new experiences had led directly to tragedy and loss. Their deaths served as a stark reminder that adventure travel, particularly in wilderness areas populated by large predators, carries inherent risks that cannot be completely eliminated through planning, preparation, or professional guidance. The survivors of the attack, despite their various recoveries and adaptations, remained forever changed by their encounter with one of nature's most powerful predators. Their experience served as testimony to both human resilience and human vulnerability when confronted with the raw power of the natural world, operating according to its own ancient laws of survival and predation. The next stories. When the forest watches back. The Helena National Forest stretched endlessly before them, a cathedral of towering pines and Douglas firs that seemed to whisper secrets in the October wind. Paul Andrews adjusted his rifle strap and checked his GPS one more time, the small screen glowing blue against the gathering dusk. Beside him, his longtime hunting partner, Hunter Lee, was scanning the tree line with practiced eyes, searching for any sign of the elk they'd been tracking for 3 days. "We should have turned back an hour ago," Paul muttered, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. At 42, he was the more cautious of the two, a quality that had served him well during his 20 years as a forest ranger before retirement. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who understood both the beauty and the danger of the wilderness. Hunter Lee, 5 years younger and significantly more reckless, shouldered his pack and grinned. "Come on, Paul. We've got at least another hour of light. That bull is close. I can feel it." Hunter had been Paul's protege during his early ranger days, but where Paul had learned respect for the forest's power, Hunter had developed an almost arrogant confidence in his ability to master it. The two men had been hunting together for over 15 years, their friendship forged in countless expeditions into the Montana wilderness. They knew each other's habits, could read each other's thoughts with a glance, and had always returned home safely. But something felt different about this trip from the moment they'd left Paul's truck at the Beartooth trailhead 3 days earlier. The forest around them was unusually quiet. Paul had noticed it immediately. The absence of bird calls, the way even the smaller mammals seemed to have vanished from their usual haunts. In his ranger days, he'd learned that when the forest went silent, it usually meant a predator was nearby. A big one. "Hunter, I'm serious. Something's not right out here." Paul stopped walking and held up his hand. "Listen." Hunter paused, tilting his head. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant sound of running water. No chattering squirrels, no calling ravens, no rustling of deer moving through the underbrush. "So it's quiet. Maybe we just picked a good spot away from all the weekend warriors," Hunter said, but even he sounded less certain now. Paul pulled out his topographical map, spreading it across a fallen log. His finger traced their route from the trailhead, across Bear Creek, up the steep switchbacks to their current position on what the map labeled as Widow's Ridge. They were approximately 12 miles from the nearest road, in some of the most remote terrain in the Helena National Forest. "Look at this," Paul said, pointing to several symbols on the map. "Bear activity warnings all through this area. Multiple reports this season of a large grizzly, possibly a male defending territory." Hunter leaned over the map, his confidence wavering slightly. "We've got rifles, Paul. And we've dealt with bears before. Not like this one, according to the reports I read before we came out here. Fish and Wildlife has been tracking a problem bear, over 7 feet tall, estimated at 600 pounds or more. He's already destroyed 2 campsites this season and charged a group of hikers near Bear Creek last month." The wind picked up, carrying with it a scent that made both men freeze. It was musky, wild, and unmistakably animal, but stronger and more pungent than anything they'd encountered before. Paul's ranger training kicked in immediately. "Bear scent," he whispered. "Fresh." Hunter slowly unslung his rifle, a .308 Winchester that had never failed him in 15 years of hunting. Paul did the same with his .30-006, both men now moving with the careful precision of experienced woodsmen who understood they were no longer the hunters. The scent grew stronger as they stood there, and Paul realized with growing alarm that it was coming from multiple directions. Bears were typically solitary animals, except during mating season or when a mother was with cubs. But this was October, well past mating season. "We need to back out," Paul said quietly. "Now." But as they turned to retreat down the trail they'd climbed, Hunter grabbed Paul's arm. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, something massive was moving parallel to their position. It was dark brown, nearly black, and even at a distance they could see it was enormous. "Jesus Christ," Hunter breathed. "Look at the size of that thing." The bear stopped moving and turned toward them. Even from over 100 yards away, they could see its distinctive silver-tipped fur and the pronounced shoulder hump that marked it as a grizzly. But what struck them both was its behavior. Instead of fleeing or posturing defensively, it simply stood there, watching them with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Paul had encountered dozens of grizzlies during his ranger career, but he'd never seen one display this kind of calculated awareness. Most bears, even aggressive ones, showed some combination of fear, curiosity, or territoriality when encountering humans. This bear showed none of those things. It was studying them. "Back away slowly," Paul whispered. "No sudden movements." "Don't look directly at it." They began to retreat, but the bear started moving again, not toward them, but continuing its parallel course. It was maintaining its distance while keeping them in sight, classic stalking behavior that Paul recognized with growing dread. As they descended the ridge, Paul pulled out his satellite communicator, a device he'd insisted they bring, despite Hunter's protests about ruining the experience. The small screen showed no signal. They were in one of the few dead zones in the forest, a deep valley where the surrounding peaks blocked satellite coverage. "The comm's dead," Paul said. "We need to get to higher ground or find a clearing." But Hunter was no longer listening. He was staring back up the ridge, his face pale. "Paul, there's another one." Following Hunter's gaze, Paul saw a second massive shape moving through the trees, this one coming from the opposite direction. 2 grizzlies, both enormous, both displaying the same unnatural stalking behavior. In 20 years as a ranger, Paul had never heard of grizzlies hunting in coordination. It went against everything he knew about bear behavior. But there was no denying what he was seeing. 2 massive predators moving to flank them with tactical precision. "Run," Paul said quietly. "What?" "Run!" They crashed through the forest, abandoning all pretense of stealth. Behind them, Paul could hear the sound of massive bodies moving through the underbrush, not the clumsy crashing of frightened animals, but the purposeful pursuit of experienced predators. Paul's lungs burned as they fled down the steep slope, jumping over fallen logs and dodging between trees. His ranger training told him that running from a bear was the worst possible strategy, but his instincts screamed that these weren't normal bears following normal behavior patterns. Hunter stumbled and nearly fell, caught himself against a pine tree. "Paul, we can't outrun them. We have to fight." Paul grabbed his friend's shoulder, steadying him. Around them, the forest had erupted into noise, the sound of large animals moving fast, branches breaking, and something else that made Paul's blood run cold: vocalizations. The bears were communicating with each other, using low, huffing sounds and what almost sounded like calls. "The creek," Paul gasped, pointing toward the sound of running water they'd been hearing. "Bears don't like to cross running water if they don't have to. We can follow it downstream." They crashed through a final stand of trees and emerged at Bear Creek, a fast-moving mountain stream about 20 feet wide. The water was crystal clear and shockingly cold, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above them. Without hesitation, they plunged into the stream. The icy water took Paul's breath away, but he forced himself to keep moving. The current was strong enough to make walking difficult, but the stream bed was mostly smooth stones and gravel. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had stopped. Paul looked back to see both bears standing at the creek's edge, their massive forms clearly visible against the darkening forest. They weren't entering the water, but they also weren't leaving. They were waiting. "Why aren't they following?" Hunter asked, his teeth chattering from the cold. Paul studied the bear's behavior, his ranger experience trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "I think they know something we don't." As if in response to his words, they heard another sound, the distinctive huffing and grunting of more bears coming from downstream. Paul's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. "They're herding us," he said in disbelief. "They're actually herding us." The impossibility of the situation struck him like a physical blow. Grizzly bears didn't hunt in packs. They didn't coordinate attacks. They didn't use tactical thinking. But everything he was witnessing suggested exactly that kind of intelligence and cooperation. Hunter raised his rifle, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. "I'm not going down without a fight." "Wait," Paul said, grabbing the barrel. "Think about this. If they wanted to attack us directly, they would have done it already. They're trying to drive us somewhere specific." The sounds from downstream were getting closer, more huffing, the splash of large bodies entering the water, the scrape of claws on stone. Paul looked upstream and saw more movement in the trees. They were completely surrounded. "There!" Paul pointed to a large boulder in the middle of the creek, about 10 feet high and relatively flat on top. "If we can get up there, we'll have a 360-degree field of fire, and they can't approach without exposing themselves." They waded toward the boulder, the current trying to sweep them off their feet. Paul boosted Hunter up first, then Hunter helped pull Paul up onto the rock. From their new vantage point, they could see the full scope of their situation. 5 grizzly bears had emerged from the forest and taken positions around the creek. All were massive. All displayed the same unnatural coordination. They weren't charging or showing typical aggressive behavior. They were simply containing the 2 men, like a pack of wolves surrounding prey. Paul's mind raced through his training, trying to find some explanation for what he was witnessing. Grizzlies were known to scavenge together at salmon runs or garbage dumps, but this was different. This was organized, purposeful hunting behavior. "Paul," Hunter's voice was barely above a whisper. "Look at their eyes." Paul focused on the closest bear, a massive male with scarred flanks that suggested he'd survived many fights. The bear's eyes weren't showing the typical emotions Paul had learned to read in wild animals: fear, aggression, territoriality, or simple hunger. Instead, there was something that looked disturbingly like calculation. The bears maintained their positions as darkness began to fall. Paul checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. They had maybe 30 minutes of usable light left, and the October nights in Montana could drop below freezing. Wet clothes and exposure would kill them as surely as the bears, just more slowly. "We can't stay here all night," Hunter said, stating the obvious, "but I'm not seeing any way out." Paul studied the bears' positions, looking for any gap in their coverage. The animals had spaced themselves with mathematical precision, covering every possible escape route while maintaining enough distance to avoid rifle fire. "There!" Paul pointed to the downstream position. "That bear is younger, smaller. If we could break through there." "It's still a grizzly, Paul. Even a small grizzly is 400 pounds of muscle and claws." Paul knew Hunter was right, but they were running out of options. The cold was already affecting their motor skills, and hypothermia would set in quickly once the sun went down. Then he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of cubs calling to their mother. The distinctive mewing cries were coming from the forest behind the largest bear. "Oh God," Paul whispered, "there are cubs." The reality of their situation hit him like a sledgehammer. They weren't dealing with territorial males or opportunistic predators. They were facing a family group of grizzlies with at least one protective mother. That explained the coordinated behavior, the calculated stalking, the refusal to be deterred by the presence of armed humans. Mother grizzlies defending cubs were the most dangerous animals in North America. They would fight to the death without hesitation, and their protective instincts could drive them to extraordinary lengths. If these bears perceived Paul and Hunter as threats to the cubs, there would be no backing down, no deterring them with noise or gunfire. "We have to try to communicate that we're not a threat," Paul said. "Move slowly, keep your rifle lowered, avoid direct eye contact." But even as he spoke, he knew it was hopeless. They were trapped on a rock in the middle of a stream, surrounded by the most dangerous predators on the continent, with darkness falling and hypothermia setting in. The largest bear, clearly the matriarch of the group, began to move closer. She entered the water without hesitation, her massive paws finding purchase on the slippery stones. The other bears maintained their positions, but Paul could see them tensing, preparing for action. "Paul, she's coming," Hunter said, raising his rifle despite Paul's earlier words. "Don't shoot unless you have to," Paul replied, but his own finger was on the trigger of his 30-006. "If you wound her without killing her instantly, they'll all charge." The matriarch was halfway to their boulder now, her huge form moving through the water with surprising grace. Up close, her size was overwhelming. Paul estimated she was well over 500 pounds, with paws the size of dinner plates and claws that gleamed like black daggers in the fading light. She stopped about 15 feet away and reared up on her hind legs, towering over them even from that distance. Paul had seen this behavior before. It was a threat display, but also an assessment. She was judging their threat level, deciding whether they needed to be eliminated or simply intimidated into submission. "Easy, girl," Paul said softly, using the calm, non-threatening tone he'd learned during his ranger training. "We're not here for your cubs. We just want to leave." The bear dropped back to all fours, but didn't retreat. Instead, she began a series of vocalizations, huffs, growls, and sounds Paul had never heard from a grizzly before. The other bears responded with their own calls, creating a complex conversation that sent chills down Paul's spine. "They're coordinating an attack," Hunter said, his voice tight with fear. "I can see it in their body language." Paul had to admit his friend was right. The bears were shifting position, tightening their circle. The matriarch was keeping their attention while the others maneuvered for advantage. "On my signal, we both fire at the big female," Paul said quietly. Aim for the heart-lung area, just behind the front shoulder. We have to drop her with the first shot." Hunter nodded, steadying his rifle against his knee. "What about the others?" "We'll have to make every shot count. Grizzlies can cover 30 yards in 3 seconds, even when wounded." The matriarch took another step closer, her massive head swaying from side to side as she tested the air currents. Paul could smell her now, a wild, musky scent mixed with something else, something that reminded him unpleasantly of a slaughterhouse. Then he saw something that made his heart stop. Caught in the bear's teeth were scraps of fabric, modern outdoor gear in colors that didn't occur naturally in the forest. These bears had killed humans before, recently. "Hunter," Paul whispered urgently. "Look at her mouth." Hunter followed Paul's gaze and went pale. "Jesus Christ, are those clothing scraps?" "Recent ones. The implications hit them both immediately. The bear attacks reported in the area hadn't been defensive encounters or cases of mistaken identity. These bears were actively hunting humans, and they'd been successful. The matriarch seemed to sense their realization and let out a sound unlike anything Paul had ever heard from a bear, a deep, rumbling vocalization that sounded almost like satisfaction. She was close enough now that they could see her eyes clearly, and what Paul saw there chilled him to the bone. Intelligence, not the simple cunning of a wild animal, but something more complex. This bear was thinking, planning, enjoying the hunt. "Now," Paul whispered. Both rifles fired simultaneously, the reports echoing off the surrounding peaks like thunder. Paul's shot took the matriarch center mass, exactly where he'd aimed. Hunter's bullet struck her high in the shoulder, spinning her around. For a moment, Paul thought they'd won. The massive bear staggered, blood flowing from her wounds, but then she steadied herself, turned back toward them, and charged. Paul had seen wounded grizzlies before, but nothing had prepared him for this. Despite 2 serious gunshot wounds, the bear moved with terrifying speed and purpose. The water barely slowed her down as she closed the distance to their boulder. "Shoot! Shoot!" Paul screamed, working the bolt of his rifle frantically. Hunter's second shot took the bear in the head, but the angle was wrong, and the bullet glanced off her massive skull. Paul's shot caught her in the neck, but still she came on. The bear reached their boulder and reared up, her massive paws slapping against the stone just feet from where they stood. Blood flowed from her wounds, but her eyes remained focused and intelligent. She was dying, but she wasn't stopping. Paul fired again, point blank into her chest. The bullet punched through her heart, and finally, mercifully, the great bear collapsed back into the stream with a splash that soaked them both. But their relief lasted only seconds. The other bears, instead of fleeing as Paul expected, began closing in. The death of the matriarch hadn't deterred them, it had enraged them. "We're in deep shit," Hunter said, frantically reloading his rifle. The nearest bear, a massive male with a distinctive white patch on his chest, entered the water and began moving toward them. Behind him the others followed, their eyes reflecting the last light of day like glowing coals. Paul tried to work the bolt of his rifle and felt his heart sink. The mechanism was jammed, probably damaged when he'd fired that last close-range shot. He had 1 round left in the chamber, and then he'd be defenseless. "My rifle's jammed," he told Hunter. "How many rounds do you have left?" 3, maybe 4, Hunter replied, tracking the approaching male with his scope. "Not enough." The white-chested male was 20 feet away now, moving through the water with deliberate intent. Paul could see intelligence in its eyes too, the same unsettling awareness he'd seen in the matriarch. Whatever was affecting these bears, it wasn't limited to a single animal. "Wait until he's closer," Paul said. "We need to make every shot count." But as Hunter prepared to fire, something unexpected happened. The bear stopped and looked back toward the forest, his massive head tilted, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. The other bears did the same, their attention suddenly focused on something else entirely. Then Paul heard it too, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors growing louder by the moment. "Search and rescue," Paul breathed. "Someone must have reported us overdue." The bears heard it too, and their behavior changed instantly. Instead of continuing their attack, they began retreating toward the forest. The white-chested male looked back at the two men once, his eyes promising a future reckoning, then disappeared into the trees. Within minutes, a Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks helicopter appeared over the creek, its powerful searchlight illuminating the scene. Paul waved frantically, and he could see the pilot's shocked expression as the light revealed the massive dead grizzly in the stream below. The helicopter couldn't land in the narrow creek valley, but it hovered while the crew dropped a rescue basket. Getting down from their boulder and into the basket while hypothermic and exhausted was one of the most difficult things Paul had ever done. But 20 minutes later, they were both aboard the aircraft, wrapped in emergency blankets and heading toward civilization. "What the hell happened down there?" the crew chief shouted over the rotor noise. "We've never seen anything like this." Paul looked out the window at the dark forest below, knowing that somewhere in those trees, intelligent and deadly predators were planning their next hunt. "I'm not sure anyone would believe us if we told them," he replied, but he knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to make people understand that something had changed in the Helena National Forest. The bears weren't acting like bears anymore. They were acting like something much worse. The helicopter carried them toward the lights of Helena, leaving the dark forest and its secrets behind. But Paul knew this wasn't over. The bears had tasted human blood, had learned to hunt cooperatively, had developed the intelligence that went beyond anything in the scientific literature. And somewhere in the darkness below, they were still out there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting humans to venture into their territory. The forest had become a hunting ground, and humans were no longer the apex predators. They had become the prey.